So hello everyone, this is Pujashri and I am a member of program committee for CSPC. And on behalf of CSPC, a very warm welcome to everyone. So as Charles already mentioned, we are about to participate in this exciting symposium at CSPC 2020. And the symposium is going to be on equity, diversity, and inclusion in the Canadian STEM fields. So I want you to know that the session ID for the symposium is EDI. And the symposium consists of 3 sessions, as Charles mentioned before, organized by the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, the Immigrant and International Women in Science Network, and the Mount St. Vincent University. But before we start this symposium, this exciting symposium, I want to add a couple of housekeeping notes. One is please turn off your videos and microphones so that there is no disturbance and chaos. Please also note that this session would be recorded, so just be prepared for that. And finally, please do not forget to tweet about your favorite panel or events at the conference using @SciencePolicy and hashtag CSPC 2020. More importantly, in the chat box, I will be adding the links for a short survey that should take only a minute or 2 of your time to fill it, but you can fill the survey at any point during the session. I encourage you all to please fill this survey to help us make CSPC better in future, also considering the fact that we are navigating to this new online medium. So again, without further ado, I will now pass things over to Anya Waite, who is the Associate Vice President Research of Dalhousie University and Scientific Director for Ocean Frontier Institute, as well as the moderator of this first panel, as Charles mentioned before. This panel is called Proactively Planning for Gender Equity and in the Emerging Blue Economy. So over to you, Anya. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pooja, and thanks for all your work that you've done, and you and your colleagues in getting this set up for this. So much appreciated. And thanks to my colleagues who are on the panel. As Pooja mentioned, my name is Anya Waite, and over my 34-year career as a scientist in the ocean sector, I've worked in Canada, the US, New Zealand, and Australia as a seagoing oceanographer, so lots of familiarity with steel-toed boots and hard hats. I've been a technology manager in New Zealand, and I was an engineering professor for 17 years in Australia before taking leadership roles as head of biological oceanography at the Alfred Wegener Institute in Germany, and most recently, my work at the head of the Ocean Frontier Institute. So just to get us started, as Canada emerges as a strong economy, as we hope, post-COVID, of course, dedicated to excellence in science, technology, and innovation, we really face challenges, as do all nations, at the forefront of EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion, for women, immigrants, and minorities in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And just anecdotally, I've spent quite a lot of energy in various institutions bringing in an analysis of where we're losing our female staff. And it's really interesting. It's actually, you can analyze it, you can fix it, if you know where it is. And so that's one of the things that that has really struck me over the years, that we can, some of these problems are fixable, and it's not just the inevitable drift of women out of STEM fields as we go forward. So we're going to discuss the EDI challenges for women in the blue economy going forward, and ask ourselves, how can we be proactive, and what types of mechanisms can we use to make sure that women are well represented? We're going to do that today through the lens of our experiences, and particularly our 3 panel members. And I'd like to just introduce our panel members first before going forward. We have with us today Kendra MacDonald, who's the CEO of Canada's Ocean Supercluster and formerly Chief Audit Executive at Deloitte Global. We have Gerald Singh, who's an assistant professor at Memorial University of Newfoundland, chair of the Sciences Sectoral Commission with CC UNESCO, and deputy director of research with the Nippon Foundation Ocean Nexus Center at UW Earth Lab. We also have Rima Hamoui, Director General of Strategic Policy and Priorities at Department of Fisheries and Oceans, or Fisheries and Oceans Canada. So thank you very, very much, all of you, for being with us today. So I'd like to proceed in that order to talk to you about your experiences and your thoughts on this topic today. So I'd like to start with you, Kendra. Maybe each of you, when I call on you, you could just say maybe a little bit about your background in the ocean sector, maybe just a line or two the way I did, just to give us a little bit of orientation about where you're coming from. So I guess I was going to ask you, Kendra, as your first question, how can technology help organizations to manage these kind of natural biases?
Sure. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm, as Anya mentioned, I'm the CEO of Canada's Ocean Supercluster. I've been in that role for the last 2 years. Prior to that, I was with Deloitte for almost 25 years, and I worked in Australia, Hong Kong, Montreal, Ottawa, and now St. John. So I've had an opportunity to sort of, and I worked a bit in Russia as well, so see some of the different challenges faced by women, both in that role, because I spent a lot of time in technology and disruption from a Deloitte perspective, and then now more specifically in the ocean sector for the last couple of years. So, you know, I think the technology piece is a really interesting one when we think about how we manage some of the equity and inclusion issues, because so I'm going to say this and then I'll sort of almost contradict myself. So theoretically, technology is without bias, right? So there's lots of examples of being able to leverage artificial intelligence and algorithms to be able to select candidates in recruiting processes and really avoid some of the biases that can come immediately just from reading a name or making an assumption on competency, or the tendency that we may have to trend towards candidates that look and feel more like us. It's just a bit of a human nature, an unconscious bias, as they would say. And so artificial intelligence can really help with that, to the extent, right, that the algorithm itself does not have bias built into it. So that is one of the fundamental challenges of artificial intelligence, is how you make sure that when you build the algorithm, because the algorithm will be applied consistently, if it consistently has a bias in terms of how it selects the candidates, then that obviously repeats itself over and over again. But I think there's a lot of awareness around that, and therefore a lot of potential, I think, that brings to really be able to measure the candidate based on competency and move away from some of the natural bias that we have in these decisions, because then those decisions, the recruiting is one thing, and I think we'll talk about retention, but step one is the recruiting piece. How do you make sure that you've got the right pool? How do you attract the right candidates? How do you leverage technology? How do you look at what you're posting so that you're even in your words that you're using to be able to attract candidates? Then how do you develop your pool? Then how do you make your selection for interviews, and how technology helps with a number of those things. I'll stop there.
Oh, very interesting. And, in addition to technology, what have you actually seen? What types of techniques and actions have you seen work in creating a more inclusive environment?
So I think step one is just being aware. So that is something that, from a supercluster perspective, so one of the things that the supercluster is focused on, so we're trying to build an ecosystem. And one of our objectives in strengthening the ocean ecosystem for Canada is inclusion. And so, just thinking about when we make an Ocean Day video, do we have participants? Do we have gender? Do we have ethnicity? Have we actually consciously thought about our spokespeople? Because that sends a message, right? The more inclusive we are in the role models that we're putting in front to speak on the ocean economy, the more that is representative, that changes the conversation. Same with our hiring. So we've done a lot of thinking about and had our postings reviewed, right? So is there something in the posting that would naturally alienate certain parts of the population? And so we're not even attracting the candidates that we're looking for in the first place. And then with our pool of candidates as well. So making sure that we are thinking about balance. And in fact, in our organization, from a senior leadership perspective, when I started, we were all women. So we actually had to make a conscious gender choice to be able to make sure that we had balance the other way, because I think In ocean, we are trying to solve really big challenges, and that needs as much diversity of thought as possible. And so I think this diversity and inclusion piece is incredibly important for the challenges that that we're trying to solve, and the workforce that we're trying to build. It will take everybody. And very specifically, we have a project, our first sort of project focused on inclusion, which is our Indigenous Career Pivot Pilot Project. And that is looking at helping mid-career Indigenous pivot into an ocean, a potential ocean role. And I think, again, that was consciously looking at where there was a gap and actually developing a program to try to be able to address that gap.
Thanks very much, Kendra. And we'll come back to some of the issues you've raised in a minute. I was just going to go next to Gerald and ask you, how do you think that gender equity is actually addressed in Canada's blue economy strategy?
Thanks, Anya. I'm hoping you can hear me all right. Yeah, can you hear me? Okay. So I think in Canada, for the for emerging kind of blue economy program, I think gender equity is largely addressed through this kind of pan-Canadian framework on what they call kind of GBA plus. So it's this gender-based analysis plus. And so it's really a way to account and track who's part of different segments of the ocean economy. And it's it focuses not just on gender necessarily, but also on other aspects of identity that is really important from an inclusivity lens. And so I guess in terms of like who I am myself and how my experiences and how I can speak to this topic in general. I mean, I don't identify as a woman, but I'm a minority scientist. And so dealing with these kind of inclusivity measures, I was very, I guess, heartened to see that Canada's use of not just a GBA, but a GBA plus. And so this idea of looking at how not just women overall, but women from different minority backgrounds, women of different sexualities, men of different minority backgrounds, and how all that kind of makes up the picture of who's involved in Canada's ocean sector. And so I think that's but just that whole GBA plus approach is I think the main way that Canada is addressing gender equity issues in its blue economy strategy. But it's also Canada has still yet to fully put together its blue economy strategy, so there might be more coming for it. But I know that's going to be one major pillar of it.
Thanks, Gerald. And what are emerging strategies that blue economy industries, both emerging and established, might be able to use to address gender issues in their organizations?
Yeah, it's a big question. I think whenever you talk about how to bring in people or how to recruit, it's always an issue that goes beyond the sector itself, right? So because you're dealing with issues that are society-wide issues, and I think just equity and inclusion issues are bigger than the ocean sector, but the ocean sector has to work within that. And so I think it's interesting to think differently about more established sectors versus emerging, because I think most of the emerging sectors in the blue economy, so things like biotechnology, energy, aquaculture, seabed-based industries, they're all highly technical. They take a lot of there's a lot of skills needed for them. And so I think there has to be a lot of work through kind of the pipeline of training. So linking with universities and training organizations will be really, really key for that. And I mean, I think in both the established and the emerging industries too, we always have to think about gender also through kind of some of the cultural norms and how our culture treats gender. And so I think like the ongoing COVID crisis, I think, has been kind of a wake-up call for a lot of people, because I think just in terms of a gendered lens, women have been maybe disproportionately hit harder than men, because in Canada, we still largely follow a model that women are caregivers. And so as we're kind of locked, especially in the early days, as we were kind of locked in and kids couldn't go to school, it was usually up to women more often to stay home too. And so I think so just given that kind of context, I think there needs to be more and more special consideration into, okay, how does our culture treat gender differences, and how can we work within those kinds of frameworks to make sure that that women can have the same opportunities men do. And so in some cases, I think that's going to be having policies and situations in place so that it can account for the fact that in a lot of households still women are treated as the primary caregiver. And so what can we do in terms of time off? What can we do in terms of flexibility and for how to actually engage in your work? So I think these are all going to be really important aspects of how any kind of blue economy strategy develops going forward.
Great, thanks very much, Gerald. Rima, welcome. Again, if you could just say one line about yourself and your background. And the question I was going to ask you was, we've talked about challenges and strategies. Once you've actually enacted a strategy, how can you measure success while building an inclusive blue economy? And perhaps you could comment on that one.
Great, thank you, Anya. Can you hear me? Great. So I am Rima Hamoui, a DFO here, and I'm actually here to really, gain the wisdom of my fellow panelists. I am in a position right now in supporting the Minister of Fisheries and Ocean in developing the Blue Economy Strategy. That is my role here. I'm leading a secretariat in developing the advice and to the minister and helping her bring forward the strategy. So I think this panel is very timely for us because it really helps to gain the wisdom and understanding of my fellow panelists and the subject matter is being discussed here today. I think I think you've hit on it exactly, and I'll pick up a little bit from where Gerald left. Federal departments and agencies have been applying GBA plus lenses to their policies and programs for some time. I think, it's fair to say that the quality and capacity for us to do that is maybe a little bit uneven and continues to improve as we move forward. There's other lenses as well now that we're looking at, in addition to the GBA plus. It's really looking at the quality of life, the impact on the quality of life of various initiatives that the government develops. I think as we develop the Blue Economy Strategy, clearly, it is really laying out a clear, coherent frame around the use of the oceans, a sustainable use of the oceans to provide for economic growth, ecosystem health, and job creation and well-being generally. As we develop, as we look at each of the sectors, and I think we've alluded to the fact that each of the sectors' gender participation is uneven. There's not a cohesive frame going across all sectors. It is somewhat uneven. As we look at each of the sectors and to determine, how do they fit into the broader strategy, and what is the government's role in that regard? There's a couple of things that have to take place. First, our analysis, our GBA GBA plus analysis that takes place. That is really a question of capacity, knowledge, and ability within the federal government, but as well working with outside stakeholders to provide us the data and the information to carry out that analysis. So there is a little bit of a relationship that has to take place in order to get the analysis. I think in terms of measuring results, when it comes to economic, to the economic world, we tend to be very comfortable in quantitative measurements, measuring GDP, job numbers. I think when it comes to gender equality and participation of the plus, intersectional participation, we may have to move a little bit away initially from the quantitative measurements. We have to have a data set in order to have that quantitative measurement. I think to get there, we have to build that data set. But in the interim, there's got to be a little bit of a qualitative measurement as well. And how do we go about that to really defining, is it enough to count the amount of numbers, the representation of women and other minority groups within the ocean economy? Or do we, should we take a step further and really looking at the quality of that participation? Really, it comes down to understanding the lay of the land, getting the data, and trying to put it together in an aggregate way in order to measure the success. It is not an easy thing for us, right? As we develop the strategy moving forward, consulting with, it will lead into a consultation initiative moving forward. It's really trying to get that information from partners, whether it's in the academic world or whether it's in the industry world or whether it's in the NGO world. We really need to have this relationship in order to get the data and to understand the kind of analysis that can lead to measuring of results, both qualitative and quantitative.
Great, thanks very much, Rima, and thank you all for your initial responses. There is one question that's come up in the chat, and I would just like to remind everyone who's on the call, we'd really love to see your questions, no question too small, and just post them in the chat and we'll do our best to get to the questions as they come up. There's a question from Mr. Maxwell, who says that the GBA plus framework was used to analyze how policies will affect people along the various diversity dimensions. Basically, he's suggesting it's not a proactive strategy. And for the blue economy, are there going to be any action plans? And if hopefully I've captured your question, Mr. Maxwell. If not, do let me know. But I think that one looks like it's going to Rima. Putting you on the spot a bit there, but I think that's exactly the right, we need to ask ourselves what types of action plans will work in this challenging environment.
Absolutely. And really, the way GBA Plus is set out, it is intended to be proactive. It is an analytical lens that we take on early in the policy development process to really understand the impacts of any program or initiatives would have on various groups. And then intersectionality around that as well. So it is intended to be a proactive tool. I think really the next point of the question is the critical aspect is once you've done the analysis and you've measured the impact, what do you do then? And it's really laying out either redesigning a program or redesigning an initiative to address those impacts, or acknowledging that those impacts cannot be addressed one way or another, and to try to come up with other mitigation measures. But it is intended to be a proactive tool. It does start at the beginning of the policy development process. I think with the Blue Economy strategy, that is our hope. That is really our intent, is as we lay out the process to develop the strategy, and it is a consultative process to develop the strategy, it's really reaching out across the sectors and across various groups to understand, what is the impact of gender participation in each of those sectors, and what is needed to improve that participation, both from a quantitative perspective and a qualitative perspective, and really working with organizations like the Ocean Supercluster, which have their pulse and their ear on emerging industries and technologies, and understanding what is going on in order for government to be able to react. And is government well placed to react in all instances? So, I think the strategy itself is intended to be a bit of an action plan towards a more inclusive growth of the ocean space. That is the purpose of the strategy, is for it to be the action plan. Really, for us, it is the analytical lens, the data that is available, and working with stakeholders in order to get that perfect recipe in order to move it forward.
Great, thank you very much. So I think I'd like to dive a little deeper into this. I think this is obviously an important area. And so there's two questions I have, and I wonder if all our panelists could respond to them. Is first of all, what are the key bottlenecks that we're seeing now, particularly in the ocean economy? And what examples of successfully getting through those bottlenecks already exists that we can learn from? Because I think it's easy to get super frustrated in this area. I myself was in an engineering faculty that never got beyond 16% women in the 17 years I was there. And I just watched initiative after initiative fail. And I could expound on the detail on why I thought they failed, but I don't think that's, I think what's probably more interesting for this audience is what works. So where are the bottlenecks and what works? I wonder, Kendra, if you could think about that one first.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about bottlenecks, these are our traditional industries. So we deal cross-sectorally. So many of the sectors that we deal with, whether it's oil and gas or fisheries, they have been traditionally more male. And so it's almost a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of it doesn't, so I talked about recruitment versus retention. So you get folks in the door, but then the overall environment, the culture hasn't changed sufficiently that actually introducing that more inclusive or more balanced or different gender, they don't feel welcome, and so they don't stay. And when we take then technology, so you think about emerging areas like ocean technology, well, technology has also been traditionally more male dominated, and there's a real programming culture in terms of women that get brought into programming but then don't stay because of the challenge of that culture. And then you combine those cultures together, you say that's a real challenge, right? In terms of how do we get a more inclusive environment, because it's such a big culture change, and then it starts right at the beginning. So how do you get more students that want to go in and play those roles, and then graduates, and then hires, and then you keep them, and so it carries on. And I liked, you know, when the vice president-elect said, see yourselves in a way that others may not, simply because they've never seen it before. And that's hard, right? It's hard to say, well, there's no one around here that looks like me, but I'm willing to carry on and persevere and be different and take it and listen and accept the fact that the comments don't make sense and they're inappropriate, but we'll just do it. Like that's a lot, right? And that's a lot to expect from a person if the environment around that person is not changing. I think, having said that, to your second question, you know, I think our next generation of leaders is taking this seriously. And so when I look at whether it's, you know, Niru Samayajula from SensorTech, and she was asked, right, how do you have an inclusion policy? Do you have a diversity? And she said, I hire the best people and it takes care of itself. That's really powerful, because you've created a culture that just naturally is inclusive and brings in the right people. And so now all those programming things that you're trying to put in place become somewhat irrelevant, because you've got the right leadership that establishes the right culture, that creates the right inclusive environment, et cetera, et cetera. And I was looking at a couple of our startups, whether it's GIT in Nova Scotia or CoLab, and they talk on their websites about whether it's commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals in the UN that include gender equity, or whether it's their commitment to kindness and I don't read my notes here, kindness and respect, and that includes an inclusive environment. And those leaders, right, by creating those environments, will help to change the sectors that they are working in. So I think that is really exciting, and they live it by their own behavior in their own companies.
Yeah, I would agree. You know, you can't pay a price for good leadership, and leadership has a huge impact. I can't express how much in my own personal situation I've found a good leader lifts the lid and a bad leader shuts you down. And so I think that's absolutely true leadership. And I'd just like to, I sent round before the panel, I sent round to the panel members a paper from 2014 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which basically sent out a couple of hundred CVs and asked people to assess whether or not the candidates were good and whether they would offer them a salary and whether they would offer them mentorship. And they gave the women's names or men's names to the same CVs, and the women were rated significantly lower. Between 15 and 25% on the numerical scale. They got salaries that were offering salaries that were half of those of the men, and they had significantly lower offers of mentorship. So it means that leadership is critical, because you need to, but it's it might not be enough in some cases, because we're dealing with an unconscious bias and statistically equal from both women and men. So women are as unconsciously biased as men are against women, which I found fascinating in that particular study. So anyway, leadership, absolutely critical. Thanks, Kendra. Gerald, bottlenecks and what examples already exist that have broken through some of them?
Thanks, Anya. And yeah, I mean, I was really interested in hearing what Kendra was saying too. It's I'm not from more of the technology side of things, so it's kind of interesting to see it from that perspective. I come from more of environmental sciences, conservation and development, I guess, in the ocean sphere. And I wouldn't say the problems is equal, because I think the issue is more on the recruitment side from where I'm from, I guess, or the circles I fall into. And again, I guess, I mean, I speak, my experiences are more from the, you know, the people of color perspective, but trying to think from the perspective of gender associated with that too. And especially conservation, but environmental science is very much like a white man's club, and it kind of has been for a while. I agree with Kendra that I think there's a generational shift in some of those attitudes, but it's still a big issue. And part of the recruitment issue is how we recruit, I think. And so coming, you know, from the environmental sciences side of things, when there is a new position that opens up, or there's a new job opportunity, it tends to spread kind of by word of mouth. It's kind of a contagious spread. And so that means a lot of times announcements are made through closed circles, or pretty closed circles. And I think there was a study that came out a few years ago about who's in the social circles of different kinds of people. It was a US-based survey, but I think they found something like 75% of white Americans only have white people in their social circle. And it was a bit more mixed among, you know, other minority groups. But so it tells you something about who actually gets to hear about job opportunities and things like that. So, and I wouldn't be too surprised if, I mean, I don't think it's going to be as strong in terms at the gender lens than it would be at the kind of race lens, but I think that the study you raised, just in terms of when people are recruiting and how they perceive a female candidate versus a male, comes into play too. So I think the recruitment side is a major bottleneck. And in terms of what we can do about it, I'm part of, I do some work, EDI related work with the Society for Conservation Biology. And I'm on a committee with an initiative that's mostly based in the US, and it's a really interesting initiative called the Diversity Joint Venture. And so in America, they have a series of things, that these federal programs, these joint ventures that are kind of cut across federal agencies, and the Diversity Joint Venture is primarily focused on diversifying conservation, race, ethnicity, gender, etc. And to try to kind of break down the kind of white man's club, I guess, of conservation careers. And so I feel like having a program like that, like the Diversity Joint Venture, it directly addresses one of those main bottlenecks of recruitment. And so basically what it is, it's a central, it mostly operates through a website. So it's a central site where you can go and look to see new federal jobs, new federal positions opening up, as well as any partner organization will often post careers there. So it gives a way to break out of that kind of closed circle networking issue, opens up to new people, and oftentimes it's with organizations that are at least saying they're trying to diversify their membership or their teams. So those kinds of initiatives, I think, have a lot of promise. I'd actually think it'd be really great to see a GBA lens applied to see how effective those programs are, because I haven't seen any statistics on them, but I think there's a lot of promise.
Yeah, thanks, Gerald. You know, I can't agree with you more. I mean, Kendra was talking about using technology that is theoretically without bias to assist in some of these recruitment things. And certainly, yeah, one of the things that in some of the organizations that I've worked in, they were having trouble with pinch points around recruitment. And it turns out that, so we did I brought in some international analysts which is as an option for any organization to bring in either gender or EDI specialists. And they found that in many cases, exactly as you suggested, in these major science organizations, when the head of a department or a major leader was being sought, there was a tapping on the shoulder process where, yes, of course, they were going to be doing technically an open search, but there was a lot of, well, you know, I've worked with this person for a long time. We know they fit in, and they would not tap them on the shoulder. And as soon as that process was you know, a strong part of the recruitment drive, and it wasn't explicitly opened as wide as it could be, it went narrow right back to mirroring the previous generation of leaders. So I think recruitment is an important pinpoint to have a look, and I think the data support that. But I also think that, you know, there's places where people have broken through. And so it'd be interesting to do an analysis of you know, there's that whole conversation about why do having women on boards, when you 50-50 boards of directors, the company is more profitable. And, you know, people saying, well, you know, women work harder, la, 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 la. Well, that may be true, but I don't think that's the sign. To me, having women on boards is a litmus test. It says you've got a transparent organization. You've got an organization that allows women to move through at the same rate as men, which means you're probably mapping transparency in other lenses as well. Anyway, just a thought. Rima, again, bottlenecks for women, or in fact, I guess Pooja has reminded me, we're not just talking about gender, although this panel is focusing on gender, but bottlenecks for EDI, and what examples exist that can inspire us?
The mute button keeps moving on me, sorry. I think going back on what Kendra and Gerald said in terms of leadership to set the culture for inclusiveness, right? Both from a gender and other groups, and as well as the need for defining the skills and being able to recruit effectively, having the recruitment base, to feed the job market. I think there is a need for a bit of transformational change, and those to me are transformational change. Cultural change is transformational in its nature, but there's also little incremental change that can help dislodge some of the bottlenecks. It could be some things that are extremely practical. And Anya, you mentioned that you've been on ships doing ocean science. Well, women on ships is not the same experience as men on ships. The ship is not designed necessarily for the female frame. and the outfits that you wear, the uniforms you wear to go on ship, aren't necessarily designed for the female frame. And especially if you're going to be on the ship for months and months and months with a collectivity of male counterparts, that is a key consideration, actually. And that is a very practical bottleneck. And I think it's these incremental things that we can look at to try to facilitate the entry of women into the field. So I do think bottlenecks exist everywhere, and I don't know that every sector has the same type of issues. I think if we look at all the ocean sectors across the board, whether it's transportation or tourism or fish and seafood, they all have their unique culture and history in terms of how the sector has developed over time. And I suspect that the bottlenecks might be slightly different in each one in terms of providing for a bit of incremental change to open up the door to allow for more inclusive participation from women and other groups, minorities. I think there's the other issue I would highlight, and I would be really curious how my panel colleagues would feel about that. It's the reverse of inclusivity of women in the mostly male-dominated workforce. It's men entering a mostly female-dominated workforce and trying to balance that out, giving room for women in the male-dominated workforce. So it's really a question of, is it just a question of looking at the participation of women in mostly male-dominated workforce, or looking at the workforce writ large and figuring out whether there are ways to provide for more equal participation from both genders, and whether that will advance the ultimate objective of inclusivity. And I think that's one area we could probably explore and discuss a bit further as well in terms of looking for action plan and strategies for the blue economy. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks for that, Rima. Really interesting. I'd like to go back to the chat, and actually, this is a conversation that we had as a panel as we were preparing for this discussion. And intersectionality being defined as how multiple identities, including race and gender, can actually lead to sort of exponentially more exclusion than just being one. And we even had, we did have panel members who were approached to be on this panel who felt that because they were working so hard to prevent racial exclusion, that they were basically in whiteout and couldn't even think about gender. And that's a very particular angle on intersectionality, which I think was very confronting and interesting to us. Well, to me personally, particularly, I'm a white woman or identify as such. And then to think about the amount of work and time that I've spent trying to deal with gender in my workplace. And then to think that on top of that, you have a racial issue that you're fighting for. And I just wonder, just volunteer, anyone on the panel, would you like to respond to, what do we need to do about the combination of race and gender, or the combination of a number of different exclusivities?
Maybe just the one quick comment I would make is, as we were looking at our workforce for our organization, because we built it from scratch, I was stepping back and thinking, I'm so proud because we had this gender balanced workforce, and then realized that we had completely kind of missed every other dimension of inclusion. And that was a real wake up moment for me to say, even consciously thinking about it, I did not consciously think about all of the various dimensions. And so we've gone back again and thought about where we post and how we post and who else we engage, and so it's hard. It is really hard, and I really appreciate. I think there's more and more conversation around, thinking about unconscious, and I've taken unconscious bias courses and all of that, and yet still that happens. So there's just so much more conversation to be had and awareness to be raised. And to your point, Anya, I mean, I identify as a white woman, so that's one challenge. And I can only imagine the additional levels of challenge that come with having another, whether it's ethnicity or whether it's LGBT, or whatever that second dimension is, or disabilities, right, is another big challenge in the workplace. So.
And just on that topic, anybody in the audience who would like to speak up or share some experience, please just send us a little message in the chat bar, and we'd be very happy to hear from you. I think these are tricky issues, and those of us in positions of leadership need to hear from colleagues who are struggling with these issues, because it really makes us do a second loop and reflect on how do we affect proper inclusion in our own organizations. So very happy to hear from anybody in the panel or not in the panel, if you have some experiences or thoughts on this one. It's a tricky and a deep issue. Any of the other panelists want to respond? Rima?
Yeah, thanks, Anya. I think the issue of intersectionality is really key. I think, looking back decades, there was a big focus on gender equality in the workplace and trying to promote the participation of women in the workplace. I think, with a global economy and globalization, increasingly now we're really looking at visible minorities and LGBTQ participation as well. I think one of the issues that, if we look at the ocean economy, our three oceans, Pacific, Atlantic, and Arctic, really a lot of the work tends to be in very remote coastal communities, right? And it's really trying to provide an environment to allow for participation of intersectional groups within that environment. And it is not always easy. It's not easy for anyone. If you think of the Arctic Ocean and the potential that may be there from a tourism perspective and otherwise, trying to recruit individuals up to the Arctic is generally quite difficult. It's and then looking at putting the lens on top of that in terms of gender and intersectionality beyond that, I think will become increasingly difficult as well. And I think really it talks about lived experiences. I am a first generation immigrant. I immigrated to Canada in 1976. I mean, if you saw me walking down the street, you wouldn't think I'm a visible minority, but I have lived the life of a visible minority. I immigrated to Ottawa, in the mid 70s, and and it's a very different place. Over time, things have evolved. They're not perfect, but I do believe we are heading in the right direction. So they are certainly heading in the right direction for women. We're not there yet. And I think, when we're looking at intersectionality, they are increasingly heading in the right direction for other groups as well, but we're not there yet. I think really the question is the speed. How fast can we, promote participation? How fast can we, put in the right infrastructure, the right policies, the right programs, and instill the right culture to really get us to the objective that we want to get to, and really defining what that is, which is equal participation, both from a quantitative and qualitative perspective. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thanks very much. There's a couple of questions in the chat. I think one of them from Selena Bishop. Do any of you have experiences of practical things that workplaces can do to create culturally safe spaces at the working level? Would any of you like to respond to that one?
Maybe one example which I found very powerful was they did an exercise where everyone shared their individuality, and inclusion was not necessarily just visible minority or gender. It could be because you have a certain habit, or you're an introvert, or because when we truly create inclusive workplaces, I think it's about accepting the whole person. Another example is a very COVID specific example, but I think it does speak to inclusion. They actually had, and this is a secondhand example, but they had red bands, yellow bands, and green bands. So if in the COVID environment you were comfortable and people could get close to you, then you wore a green band. If you really wanted to be, you were being super safe, whatever your family situation or just your personal situation, there was a stay away, you could wear the red band. And so you didn't have to feel awkward because people could identify based on that band where you sat on that spectrum and could therefore respond appropriately. And then there was communication to say everyone gets to choose, right, in terms of their level of comfort. And so I think, that's, anyway, I'll stop there, but those are a couple of, they're very different examples. But I think that the idea of inclusion for me, there's all kinds of aspects to it, but it's really getting to that place where the whole person feels comfortable coming to work. They feel comfortable sharing whatever that aspect is, and that aspect is very different from person to person.
Wow, those are really nice examples, Kendra. Thank you. And I think it speaks a little bit to Koko Akbar Sangaya's comment about that the challenge is really when you have visible and visible minorities, how do you handle those? And I think, Kendra, the examples that you've given actually do, because what they do is allow the whole person, of which their minority status or gender status is only one part, to be kind of welcomed into the organization as a whole person. So I'm thinking about that. That's a really nice, certainly a really great beginning, and something that leaders can do, right? So yay, it's an action thing. Carrie Brown says, can I just point out that we've been talking about these issues since the 70s, so speed is not a word I would associate with change. So look, I totally get that. I won't even tell you how old I am, but I've been working at this thing for 35 years. And, but that being said, in 35 years, I think we have had, when I look at my children, they are way, they look at some movies that I saw in the 70s and 80s, and they go, Mom, that's so sexist. How can you even look at that? And I'm like, oh, right. Okay, you're right. But so I think the next generation is better trained and more open to these conversations. They have other challenges. And, they have being sucked into handheld devices, which, my daughter once said to me, well, I actually think that you guys were the last actually educated generations because you read so many books and we're just always sitting here on our devices. Sorry, different thing. So we're coming up to our last 10 minutes. And I just think that, first of all, thank you everybody very much for being here and for saying what you've said. I'd like to hear from even more of our audience members, if I can, and I really appreciate those of you who've written questions in the chat. So thanks for doing that. So I guess I'd like to go to the end point here. For all of us, we're all working in various ways, using various mechanisms to try and keep our staff and our workforce as diverse and open as we can. And at the same time, we have to get on and nail our objectives and our KPIs and everything else we're doing. So it's not a simple task. What does an inclusive workforce look like then for your organization? And how would we measure that success? And I know that one of these things, maybe we could have from Rima, you might be able to tell us a little bit something about the GBA plus thing. But anyway, Kendra, perhaps, how do you know when you're inclusive and how do you measure it?
So it's a great question. I mean, maybe this is too simple an answer, but I think as we head on a journey towards the organization being reflective of sort of society as a whole, then I think you can measure that, because there's measures around what society as a whole looks like, and then how your organization kind of compares to that. And I think that's at all levels, right? So I remember when I first started in St. John's, and I went to a luncheon, and I said, well, you know, what is the gender split here? Because I came as a leader, and they said, oh, well, we're 65% women. And it's like, oh, why am I having this session on gender equity if we actually have more women than men that are working at the organization in the first place? So what I realized is, as you got further along, right, the whole, at the leadership level, we were 3/4 men and 25% women, even though we were 65% women in the organization overall. So I think that to me is the measure, is a key measure of success. And certainly for our organization, we're not there on all of the dimensions, but that's important. So.
Great, thanks, Kendra. Before I go to our next panel member, there's been a really nice comment in the chat. Poverty and socioeconomic status has a huge impact on inclusion. And actually, this was one of the colleagues that we talked to before the panel who was mentioning that they were dealing with food security. So if you're dealing with the issues of food security, how can you sit around worrying about gender? Sorry, I'm paraphrasing their message, but I think that was one of the gists of it. So this can certainly be invisible in many ways. And how do we ensure that access of if simply you are socially or economically struggling, how do we include that in our consideration of EDI? And to be honest, I don't know, and I'm wondering if any of the panels have ideas on that one.
I can say something to that, Anya, to that specifically, if we want to move away from the question of measurement. I think recently there's been quite a bit of writing coming out on the problem of the definition of merit. And I think that's a big issue we have to contend with, especially when it comes to, I mean, not just issues of gender, race, etc., because there's a lot of really odd history about people trying to quantify some inherent merit or some inherent measures of aptitude based on some of those characteristics. But just on the socioeconomic status side of things, I think almost every measure of what we consider merit usually correlates highly with socioeconomic status. And so if we have merit-based awards, and if we have merit-based ways to award people anything really, usually it leads to this kind of vicious cycle of people who started behind get left behind, and it's can be very difficult to especially get into science-based higher education, these kinds of jobs and situations. And so I honestly very personally feel like we have to switch away from merit-based to more of a needs-based approach in a lot of how we look at award scholarships, etc., that to give people opportunities. Partly because I mean I also just think the how we define merit is incredibly just troublesome, and if you give it some thought, it's actually merit's a really hard thing to define in any way that's not circular.
Oh, Gerald, that is just such that's such a great comment. I've just been reading some work on the, I think it's by Anne Borden, who works on intersectionality. And one of the things they talk about is that there is a heroism in our ideas of leadership, where we think the leader often takes credit for subsumes and is seen to be the main purveyor of the wisdom of their team. And this happens a lot in science teams. For example, you've got the big professor and you've got the graduate students and the technicians and everybody else. And often in some cases, their names aren't even there. And it's the big guy who gets the exposure. And there's a lot of discussion about, and then the merit base is, you get a research chair, you get a excellence badge, you get, and what does that mean in terms of when the work itself has been done by an enormous team? How do you assign merit to the one coordinator or leader who's, and that this is a history in particularly European male hierarchies being very A-frame, where they need to always have a leader. They need to have somebody who is the hero of the piece. And then we refine, define, and reward those heroes. And I think that's a really, I struggle because I'm a, classically trained scientist, and I think some people are smart and do a lot of good work and we should be rewarding them, right? That's my kind of worldview where I come from. So how do I take that into account and incorporate it into a discussion of merit? And can I, as a head of an institute, give someone a job or research funding based on need when I'm supposed to be running something whose criterion is by definition excellence? So I think there's some absolute, and I think it comes into one of the comments in the chat here. There are real forces at play. And we need to look critically how our organizations are complicit in some of these questions. So anyway, I think that's a really interesting part of the discussion. Are there any other comments to those last two questions? One around measuring success. Rima, I didn't want to know if you want to touch base on that briefly, or these issues of how do we define merit, or how do we define excellence, which all our organizations in different ways is trying to do in a way that's equitable.
I think going back to measuring success is, I think really, at the heart of everything that we do. It's really, if there's no way or no framework or no plan to measure success, how do we know everything that we're doing is working? How do we know the investments and the efforts and the time we're putting into something is working? So I think, laying out a framework to measuring success. And again, we talk here about the equal participation, right? The purpose of EDI is really to ensure equal participation by all segments of society to opportunity, to economic opportunity, and that is its ultimate objective. And that that needs to be measured both on a quantitative level and on a qualitative level. And it's laying out the proper frameworks and maturing within in the application of those frameworks. And Anya, you had mentioned GBA plus. The government has been carrying out GBA plus for some time, and it continues to mature that capacity. But I don't know that we have it perfectly right. And I think that is an area that needs to continue to advance and evolve, and including looking really at the impact of the quality of life on different segments of society in terms of the initiatives that are brought forward. So, I think as we look at the oceans economy, the various sectors within it, and the objective really to allow for equal participation to opportunity is what it is. Equal participation to opportunity. Finding a framework to effectively measure success is critically important. And I wish I had the answers to it. And I think, part of developing the Blue Economy strategy is really seeking out those answers and looking for input and advice from key stakeholders, from key industry sectors, in terms of how we can get there, how we can do that.
Maybe just share a story that for me was very powerful when I think about inclusion. I was up in Pond Inlet last year, and I talked to a group of Indigenous young people, and they were talking about some of the companies in the region and measuring headcount, right? So how many Indigenous workers in terms of inclusive workforce. And one of the things that they said that really stuck with me was, well, that's great, but the types of jobs that they get hired for are very manual labor. how do you help our next generation become knowledge workers and have those types of jobs? And it's not just about headcount, it's also about the type of work. And I just thought that was, when we talk about measures of success, we really need to think about what we're measuring and what that measure actually tells us about how much we've accomplished.
Great, thank you, Kendra. And I think we're coming to the end of our time. I'd just like to draw attention to Janet Valdez's comment, which kind of follows on from yours, Kendra, about in many institutions, standards around what's expected from women and men are the same, and yet women have often many either interruptions or other demands on their time. So I think it's all part of that that same challenge. So listen, thank you very much to all our panelists today for taking the time and for really allowing us to do a deep dive into some of these issues. Obviously, there's many more that we can deal with. I'd also like to thank Pooja and the team from the CSPC for organizing this symposium, and for our audience who has jumped into the chat willingly and shared their thoughts and questions. So thank you very much, everyone, and I will hand it back now to Pooja.
So welcome to the EDI Symposium if you haven't been able to attend the first session. If you have been able to attend the first session, then welcome back. Please remember to turn your video and your microphones off. We are now heading towards our second session of the symposium, entitled Through an IWS Lens, Engaging into New Solutions to Old Workplace Problems of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. The moderator for this panel is Dr. Yenet Valdez-Teixeira, and I hope I pronounced the name correctly. She is an immunologist and an independent consultant. So without any further ado, I leave the floor open for Dr. Yenet to introduce the speakers and go ahead with the panel. Over to you, Dr. Yenet. Dr. Yenet, can you hear? You are muted, Dr. Yenet.
Mute.
Yeah.
Perfect. Good afternoon, all. Thank you so much, Pooja, for the introduction. And first, I want to acknowledge that I'm calling in from the traditional and ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I am thrilled, I'm honored to present this esteemed array of fantastic panelists. With us, we have Dr. Akiko Iwasaki. Akiko, I don't know if you are here, so when I call your name, please just wave. And Akiko is a Yale University professor, immunologist, and a vocal advocate for women in science and mentorship. Dr. Alejandro Adem is a UPC professor in mathematics, is the former CEO and scientific director of MITAX, and is the current president of NSERC. Dr. Catalina Lopez Correa is the executive director of the Canadian COVID Genomic Network at Genome Canada, is the former CSO of Genome BC, Genome Quebec, and passionate about innovation and EDA. Dr. Maria Loza is an IWS co-leader in Ottawa, currently works as a program advisor at CIHR. She's committed to integrate EDI, science, and evidence-based policy in our society. And finally, we have Mr. Michael Tremblay. He is the president and CEO of Invest Ottawa and Bayview Yards, former vice president of public sector for Microsoft Canada. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this panel. But before I talk to the panel, I wanna ask you, the audience, to please answer some of our poll questions that is going in the chat. And also feel free to have questions and the questions and answers, so along the whole hour. So we will discuss this at the end of our panel. And for now, before I start the whole panel, I would like to invite a friend, Catalina, to say a few words about the IWS. And Catalina, here, you have a couple of minutes, 5 minutes to talk.
Okay, Janet, thank you so much. I will just go ahead and share my screen. I have a quick presentation to give on IWS. So can you all see my presentation? Yes? Yeah, perfect. Okay, so I will just be very brief. Well, it's first a pleasure to be here today and see so many familiar faces and people that have been working on the equity, diversity, and inclusion space as part of this meeting. And I would like to just make a quick introduction about Immigrant and International Women in Science, IWS. So the mission and the vision of IWS is to build a collaborative network that supports and promotes equity, diversity, and inclusion of immigrant and international women from STEM backgrounds in Canada. So really, the objective here is to build a network. It's not just about mentorship, it's building a network where everybody helps each other. We, in our first anniversary, actually IWS was created in 2018. So we have been already for more than 2 years, a little bit around. We have 20 pan-Canadian leaders. We have been doing activities in more than, well, 70 different city meetings with 18 public engagements. We have several followers in social media, very active in social media. I think the key element from IWS is that we come from very different backgrounds. So when we were talking in the earlier panel about intersectionality, well, this is all about IWS. We come from different countries, most of us from the South, Latin America, Africa, well, the global South. We actually started with 2 cities. We have now 9 Canadian cities where we have engagement. We have more than 500 attendees to our activities, 400 member lists when we started with a handful of members. So it has been really growing exponentially and showing the need we have in terms of building these networks and supporting each other to advance our careers in science as part of the equity, diversity, and inclusion challenges we're facing. So here we just show where we're coming from. So as I say, lots of us are from the Global South, but it's really a very diverse group of people that is making part of IWS. And this is based on a recent survey that we did with IWS, where it was self-declare. People were self-declaring their procedence, their nationalities, and giving us this information to IWS. Now, the language, we have also a huge language diversity, Spanish being one, and my language being one of the important ones, but we really have all kinds of different languages that are part of our network. Now, in terms of education, you see that an important group is people that have obtained their PhD outside of Canada, but we have also people that have obtained their master's degrees in Canada. So it's very diverse, but again, the common point is people that are qualified in science and STEM, and are now trying to find their work and their path, their professional path in Canada. In terms of employment, that's where we start to see some of the challenges we are facing. 48%, as declared in this survey, 48% of the participants in the survey will say actually that they are not working in their field of expertise, which is significant. 17% somewhat working in their field of expertise, and only 34% are working in their field of expertise. In terms of job opportunities, what we see also is almost 70% are not fully satisfied with the current job opportunities they have in Canada. And 60% are not satisfied with their current opportunities. So super qualified people that are coming to Canada and are not really finding their paths and are not super satisfied, super happy with their actual positions. This also is an interesting and quite shocking slide for me. So in terms of the COVID impact, about what we got with the surveys, that about 41% of the women that answered the survey are the main caregivers in the family. And about 14% of those lost their jobs due to the COVID impact and the COVID pandemic. So that's, again, showing us a difficult reality we're facing and that we are not always seeing so clearly. And here are, we invite you to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, send us an email if you have questions. And again, this is just a network that was created organically. There's no incorporation, there's no funding. It's just a bunch of volunteers believing and really wanting to work hard to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion in Canada and to make, our voices heard across the country. So thank you, Janet, for that. I think I've finished the presentation and we can go ahead with that. You're on mute, Janet. You're on mute.
Yeah, thank you so much, Catalina. Yeah, these are significant stats, and I hope we can all hear what is happening now in our country. So before starting with our panelists, and we will kick off like with one single sentence that our panelists have faced in the workplace, something that illustrates an EDI challenge that you have faced in your career. Just single sentence, please. Go ahead. Maybe Akiko, we should start with you.
I'm really sorry to interrupt in between, but Janet, I remember you telling us that we have a poll to fill. And if we have to fill the poll, then we'll have to pause for a while. So I think that probably would be the best thing to do right now if you want the poll to be answered by everyone.
Okay, sure, perfect. Thank you, thanks, Pooja.
No, that's perfectly okay. So
yeah,
so the polls are there. Please go ahead and fill them.
Pooja, are you okay now? Just give me the okay to continue with the panel, please.
Yeah, sure. I think we would probably have the polls for a minute and a half or a minute. Okay. Yeah, and then we will just end the polls.
Okay, so to the panelists, you have a minute to think in one single sentence of what you want to tell us.
Mm-hmm. Or we do not really see a lot of progress on the polls anymore. So maybe this is the perfect time to end the polls.
Perfect.
Okay. So, yeah, so we have our results and please go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No problem, no problem. Okay, let's continue with the panelists now, and we would like to ask one single sentence that illustrates an EDI challenge that you have faced in during your career. Please, Akiko, go ahead.
Hi. Before I answer that one sentence question, I just want to thank you, Janet, and other panelists for having me on this very important discussion. So I guess one of the things that I have faced as a challenge in my career is sort of my voice being ignored or not taken seriously, especially in a meeting where everyone else is a white male.
Thank you. Michael, are you there?
Yes, thank you. And also very grateful to be part of today's panel. I would say for me, I've had no blockers, which I think is part of the point of today's discussion. I've been in the sector for since the mid-'80s, and the observation I would have, there's been very little change since the mid-'80s until now in terms of the composition of the tech workforce. It's a bit sad.
Yeah, definitely. Catalina, I see you there.
Yes, Janet. So a couple of the challenges really quickly, language being one, not being able to, express yourself as you express when you're in your, mother language, or I would say silence voices, as Akiko said, that you sometimes will speak to your area and people will, you will not have the same credibility as other people that were trained in the country or that coming from the country or that look different will have. So that credibility, and on top of for immigrant women, when you immigrate to another country, you have all the emotional stress on your personal and professional life that typically you might not have when you stay in your same country. So those are some of the challenges.
Thank you. Alejandro, I don't know.
Yes, well, I would say our big challenge would be, how do I get my foreign qualifications taken seriously when I apply for a job or a graduate degree? How do I do that? How do I accomplish it?
Yeah, thank you. Maria?
Thank you, Janet. Also, I take the opportunity to say I'm very grateful to be here in this panel on behalf of IWS. And so to answer your request, well, a general barrier that immigrants will face in Canada, as Alejandro just mentioned, and this is for labor market integration, is the distrust of their foreign credentials and the foreign experience that sometimes it's disregarded. And many times this leads to a biased perception for our fit in the Canadian workplace.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Now we are going to go through specific questions for each panelist. This question will go to Alejandro. Alejandro, according to the Diversity Gap 2019, the deans of the U15 Canadian universities are predominantly white and male, with only 2.9% being visible minority women. A concern of the IWS community is that we are not well represented in leadership positions and that our needs are not well met. As a university professor and NSERC president, what approaches or strategies do you think could be developed to promote a leadership change within universities? You have 2 minutes to answer this question. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. I think we have to first start at the entry point into a university and into a leadership position. By and large, the leaders are going to be faculty members, either recruited from the university itself or from other universities. So there are big challenges, certainly in the STEM field, for underrepresented groups to be recruited as permanent faculty. And we're not talking about postdocs or just research associates, the regular tenure track and then tenured faculty. So that has to be addressed in a proactive way. There are a number of EDI initiatives. Certainly NSERC has been pushing hard on those for the grant evaluation and how people are sort of considered in the whole research portfolio. But there has to be a culture change within universities, within departments, and within particular disciplines. So if you have a good representation of women, of minorities, of at-risk groups, then of course that will help. But then as the career progresses, if you're familiar with what a report is at the end of the year, your publications, your students, your grants, and then basically you're done. If you want to be a leader and you're trying to do things for the community, for the society, being on these panels, for example, on a panel such as this, what recognition do you get for that? So the recognition system does not, I feel, adequately reward or take into account the fact that people will go out and stick their neck out to do things for the community and to be leaders. And for young people to develop, right, they'll say, well, go back and write your papers, why you're wasting time. So I think that kind of culture change, and that's where the incentives are important, incentive structure to change that. So then when it comes to looking at the candidates for these senior positions, there will be a supply of candidates. Now, of course, choosing the selection committee is critical. And of course, if they go to the regular sort of old boys network, there's not going to be a change, right? Very conservative in terms of how these selections are done. So there are many different things that can and should be done to improve those statistics.
Thank you so much, Alejandro. I was wondering if any of the panelists would like to add something else to this question.
I'll get to a few of these items in my talk later, but the notion of having the right governance structure really does have an impact. If you don't change the structure at the top, it's very difficult to enact change throughout a system or an organization.
Thank you. Perfect. I have now the next question. I think we're on time. This question goes to Akiko. Several studies report that deep-rooted unconscious biases play a key role in professional discrimination against women. These biases pose a particular risk to immigrant women in STEM. Drawing upon your experience, please discuss your encounters with biased workplace policies and share your recommendations for countering such a biases at the individual and organization levels. Again, you have a couple of minutes to answer this question. Go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you for that question. I think the first step is that we all need to acknowledge unconscious bias. We all have it, and I have it, and I'm very, very eager about equity and diversity issues, but it's very deeply rooted. It's very difficult to get rid of. So once we acknowledge this bias, then we can start to see and interpret things differently. And I usually check myself on every decision, every evaluation I'm making, whether any of the unconscious bias is really playing a role. And so it's very important to keep that in mind at the individual level. At the institutional level, we need to be able to offer women and minority a welcoming and sustainable place to work. So for instance, infrastructure, including childcare, couples recruitment, cluster recruitment needs to happen in order to recruit talents in this space. Also, grand panel discussions and education of the panel about the unbiased, bias that we have, unconscious bias, is very important to evaluate grants, and just really making sure you're not influenced by the gender or the name or the country of the origin of the person that we're evaluating. And then we can also use tactics. So as I mentioned, one of the challenges I found is that voices of women are sometimes ignored in a large boardroom. And what do we do about that? We can do affirmation, which is that we can band together preemptively to consciously support each other. And also we can involve men in this effort. This is not really a woman's problem. It's a societal problem. And if we can involve men to support our voices in those settings, it's very powerful. And then we have to have mentoring and role model for women and minority in leadership roles, because we don't see a lot of leadership, being occupied by women and minority, and we need to cultivate that from the bottom up. And then finally, I think we need to have policy and institutional solutions. Just as what Alejandro mentioned, we need to have a setup where we can have sort of women progressing up the ladder in these societies. And we really need to acknowledge and tackle the biases from both top down and bottom up. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Would anybody in the panel would like to add up something else to this question?
So it really resonates with me also. I think as we go through each of these presentations, I'm draining my own content here, but I'd just like to say that I think that diversity is about just having a seat at the table. Inclusion is having a voice at the table, and belongingness is being heard. And I think these are really important concepts. Akiko, I appreciate your perspective on that.
Thank you so much. And talking about leadership now, particularly women in STEM, we have a question now for Catalina. Catalina, 2018 report shows that women occupy only 9.4% of the most senior corporate jobs. You are the executive director of the Canadian COVID Genomic Network and have considerable experience in the biotech private sector. In your experience as a woman in the senior leadership role, what types of barriers do you think exist in the private sector that impact career development for immigrant women in science, and what strategies could be implemented to overcome these barriers? Again, 2 minutes for that. Go ahead, Catalina.
Yeah, thank you, Janet. And as we have said, Mike and Akiko and Alejandro, there's a lot of common ground here. But in terms of the private sector, I think, well, starting, as you say, Janet, with the percentages. Starting with the percentages is not just at the level of CEOs, is at the level of boards, is at the level of women, immigrant women that are in the position or are giving the opportunities or giving the chance to create new companies or entrepreneurs. We see very, very low numbers. We see also very low numbers in terms of access to venture capital and the possibility to really create your own company and your own, to be an entrepreneur as a woman, as an immigrant. And I think the more we add these intersectionalities, and I speak by myself, for myself, being a woman, being a Latino, being gay, all these intersectionalities add to the challenges you face at different levels in your career. When I think about the time I used to work at Eli Lilly, I was often, as Akiko say, the only woman in the room. I was there. Often I was giving some ideas, and some of my male colleagues will take some of these ideas, say the ideas loudly, and finally that became their idea. And I was like, well, what happened here? I gave this idea. So, this is, your voice is not being heard. Your credibility, even though, sometimes I think that by the way I look, because I'm white and the people don't immediately see me as, their bias, their conscious bias. Sometimes I can go by as, camouflage as being local, but it's really not that the way it should be. And in terms of going back to the percentage, I think that there is something that bothers me, and it's bothering me, more and more often, and is that I will talk about these percentages, and people will tell me like, oh, well, and even now, 2020, it's not like 10 years ago, they will tell me, well, our company is about 60% women. And I say, well, yes, 60% women, but where are those women? Those women are at the technical level, those women are at the assistant level, but how many people, how many women, and how much diversity you have on your board, how much diversity you have on your leadership? And so sometimes, I think it's very important in the data we should gather is to disaggregate those percentages and think about the different levels when we're thinking about leadership. And I think also about my own organization, Genome Canada and the Genomic Enterprise. I was CSO at Genome BC when I was there for a few years. I was the only, for many years actually, the only female CSO across the country when there are 7 genome centers. Today, there's only one female CEO in the history, and it's 1 out of 7. So I think all these numbers are telling us that there are many, many, many challenges we're facing. As we say, our voices are not heard at the same level. The recruiting strategy, sometimes we get these messages that say, well, we didn't hire because there were no women. I'm sorry, there are plenty of women. There are plenty of women qualified. We just don't have the means and the ways to go and look. And I remember I saw a presentation by a professor at UBC that was showing us the challenges of intersectionality and the challenges when recruiting professors for the university, and how you really have to go almost for having 4 women candidates to end up having a potential woman that is taking that position. So, and I would say, just to finish, the importance of having role models and the importance of being able to follow the path of somebody else. And we see that now with some of our international leaders that are leading through the COVID. I'm talking about presidents, prime ministers, how we see, and there's a couple of cartoons that are showing some of the worst countries with some of the male leadership and some of the best countries with this female leadership. And for me, there are 3 things they have in common, these female leaders that are really handling COVID in a different way. And those 3 things are empathy. So really connecting with others. And I think women, we have this capacity. And I think when you're immigrant and you have gone through so many challenges, you learn how to connect. So immigrant women and women in general have this empathy, teamwork, the capacity to work as a team and to collaborate, and also data-driven. I don't think I know everything. And I think those presidents and prime ministers, they are ready to acknowledge they don't know everything. They are not the owners of the knowledge. They are working with other people that give them the data. They trust the data. They use that data to build their leadership. So I will just leave it there with these 3 points: empathy, teamwork, and data.
Thank you so much, Kata, for all these insights. I want to remind again the audience to please go ahead to have questions for our panelists. We might have a couple of minutes at the end, so we can still have a chat. Before going to the next question, and this question goes for Michael. Innovation is both an economic and social progress. Immigrants benefit Canadian organizations in terms of innovation, cultural diversity, and creativity. In fact, Canadian immigrant-owned small businesses had an 8% higher likelihood of implementing a product innovation and a 20% higher probability of implementing a process innovation. Given these success rates, what kind of support is being provided to new immigrants, especially women who want to start their own business in STEM? Michael, please go ahead.
That's a great question. Actually, that's a question that requires about 2 hours, but I'll do my best in 2 minutes. So I framed my thoughts on this in 3 ways. One is maybe discussing the opportunity a little bit more, because it actually is an opportunity. It's not just the right thing to do. It's a business opportunity, actually. Mm-hmm. I'd also like to identify the challenge that we've seen in our business accelerator locally, because I think the on-the-ground experience matters here. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about the how we've responded as a company to some of our learnings and how we've adjusted how we go after things. And finally, a really good, promising local example of how this can be done right. And it's a live experiment underway. So I'll do this as quickly as I can, but I think there's some good crunchy information for everybody. So firstly, I would remind everyone that even though we're in a pandemic, we're also in the 4th Industrial Revolution. That didn't stop, it's still underway. And the definition of that, put simply, is it's the fusion of digital, physical, and biological worlds, which means tech is in everything. So if you're someone with STEM skills, by definition, there's a market opportunity for you. And for those that have blind spots in identifying people that can actually help to go after these opportunities, it's a missed opportunity. And so I feel like that's extremely important. And I can tell you from our region in Ottawa, that's particularly important because our region happens to have the highest density tech capability in North America at 11.3% of the workforce. So we don't have a lot of sectors. We've got government, we've got tech, and then we've got tourism. So for us, we're hypersensitive to that topic, and we're constantly on the lookout for talent. In fact, our economic development agency has in fact created a talent recruitment and strategy team to be able to ensure that we are properly tracking these opportunities, because without talent, you can't grow. It actually is that simple. So there is a business opportunity to pay attention to this. And there's definitely an opportunity to do better. Now, our company does a lot of work for very early stage companies, also a lot of work for accelerating and scaling companies. And I can tell you we have a lot of programming. So we run 60 different programs each year. We train and have access with over 6,000 entrepreneurs during the course of the year, aside from established companies. So there's a lot that happens. But tied to the earlier comments, these training opportunities aren't always welcoming. And there are blind spots that we all have in terms of making them welcoming for different groups. Now, one area that we dug into, and I'll move into our company direction, we spent a lot of time on the topic of gender diversity 3 years ago. And we learned a lot from it. We realized how many gaps we had in our system. Our business accelerator was like a locker room. It was just the wrong environment to be conducive to make it friendly for women to want to be part of the work that we do. We had to change our governance model. We are now have a fully diverse board. We created a subcommittee to support female founders and women-owned businesses. Without this, we wouldn't have made any of the changes that we needed to make on the ground, including changing our mix of coaches and mentors so that 45% of our coaches and mentors are now women. So these are good progressive points, but now we've broadened our focus to support the topic of broader diversity and inclusion. We've actually posted this past summer a position paper on how to be a better ally. We've brought in, as part of that process, a diversity, inclusion, and belongingness strategist to help us to make sure all of our programming provides an environment that makes it open for anyone that has a good idea to come in and get the resources that they need to move that idea forward. And I would say that we really do leverage a lot of the Canadian government programming. There is a lot, it just isn't always tapped into. One that I would highlight that we're focused on is the Minister Baines recently introducing a 50-30 program. And the idea is that moving to 50% board composition that is gender diverse and 30% in the broadest sense of diversity, which I think is a really good goal. And I feel like that is something we should all aspire to. Now, let me move to a more regional example that I think is one that we found through our talent programming. We get a lot of labor data from the work we do in talent recruiting and strategy. And we share that with our local ecosystem. And there's a local company called Intac that have created a program called Ottawa Women Newcomers. And the idea of it is to ensure that we are opening up opportunities for newcomer women into our country to give them the skills that they need. It's an upskill program, so they would have to have some STEM skills to begin with. And the goal is to actually give them full stack developer capability. It's a 10-week boot camp followed by several weeks of intensive soft skills training to help with the process of being more integrated into local society, understanding some of those nuances. And I really love this program so far because the intent was only to pilot this with 60 women. There's 178 women that have applied for the program. And the end goal of it is to actually help these women find employment within 120 days of graduating. So we're following this one very closely. And I think it's these kinds of immersive programs where you get right down to the granular level where you can have high impact. So we're very hopeful and we'll follow this one through to the end of May when the program comes for renewal. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Fantastic news. Thank you so much, Michael. Now we go for a last question to our panelists, and this goes to Maria. Maria, you know that COVID-19 has had an impact on everybody's life. This causes an extra layer of challenge that impacts mental health, especially among vulnerable populations. To achieve health equity and improve immigrant women's mental health, how do you see the IWS network or other grassroots organizations partnering with or collaborating with the government of Canada or the Canadian Society to support immigrant women in science to overcome these challenges? Please, Maria, go ahead. You have a couple of minutes.
Thank you, Jane. Indeed, mental illness crisis has loomed as a consequence of this pandemic. And globally, we have heard that the lowest level of mental health are reported by women. And Statistics Canada confirmed it and reported that in particular recent immigrant women expressed that they feel anxiety in higher rates than their male counterparts. So I think we need to understand first, why is this? In Canada, the federal government has an immigration policy that aims at attracting highly skilled workers for the labor market. However, international trained individuals face specific challenges in obtaining work in their fields once in Canada. An example, at the beginning of the year, the Public Policy Forum reported that immigrant women experience even poorer outcomes when looking for a job than immigrant men. As Catalina showed on our IWS survey, 69% of the participants said that they are not satisfied with the current job opportunities in Canada. And among the reasons that they report are that they lack a strong networking, they face distrust of their foreign credentials, and they lack Canadian experience. Of course, they are just arriving to Canada. And their foreign experience is many times disregarded. Now, in the COVID context, recent immigrant women in science have to add to the list difficulties to networking, fear to losing their jobs, worries about productivity, face fewer job opportunities if they just arrive, and delays on processing of visas and work permits. So what can the IWS network and other organizations do? We are a voice to raise awareness across different sectors, and we can serve as a source to gather data through surveys that can help for evidence-based policymaking, in particular for the government sector, because we are a first point of contact for information to that particular population, so the immigrant women in science. And we can also serve as a liaison between immigrant women in science and employers as we grow as a network. But we need to target specific issues here. So we need to push forward for solutions to the qualification mismatch. And to do that, we need programs that reflect transferable skills from foreign credentials and or upgrade the skills to better align with those required by Canadian employers. We also need employer engagement, employing individuals from the immigrant talent pool, and innovative practice to recruit and create inclusive environments for IWS. And in the pandemic context, it is necessary to make accessible psychological services for everyone. So facilitating the integration of immigrant women in science to the labor market, as Mike said, it will help the Canadian economy. And it's an opportunity that we are missing, we have been missing for some time. And good policy is critical to making Canada a better place for everyone, and a better place, one that is fair and inclusive, has always a positive impact in mental health. And IWS is making efforts towards that.
Thank you so much, Maria. And I would like to invite the panelists, if you have any other creative ideas to, COVID is something totally new for us in our lives. So now it's a time to start thinking in new solutions for this new problem that just exacerbated, especially in women and in many countries. So if you have any other ideas, please go ahead. And
I just want to jump in here. So thank you very much for that, Maria. I think one of the issues we see is going from saying having been a student in a foreign country to being like a postdoc in Canada. The postdocs that NSERC offers are by and large just for domestic, for Canadians and permanent residents. So there's a lag, there's a disconnect there in terms of certifying, because if that's within the scientist's jurisdiction of being able to take a foreign trained person and bring them, upscale them with a postdoc, if that were more open to international, then that flow of talent that Mike is talking about, organization like NSERC, we train them in the STEM, we have around 37,000 trainees. And of course, they're not going to be professors and researchers, and by and large, most of them are going to go to companies and work for Mike and the companies there. And that's part of what the STEM education is about. So those are like roadblocks which are create these kind of issues. And I think we have to look at them. And when the government talks about the talent, the pipeline of talent they want to attract, then we have to think comprehensively as destination Canada, how and we want to build in our diversity, and we have the EDI considerations. So we have to put all these things together in a way that is really effective and really achieves those goals.
Thank you. Michael, wanted to say something else?
I think Catalina has her hand up. I can talk after she's done.
Okay, I don't see Catalina.
Yeah, thank you, Janet. And well, I just wanted to say that I think it's important also to open this dialogue. I think if we look at the list of assistants here that we have in this panel with this discussion, well, first already it's great to have Mike and Alejandro as part of the panel, because you know what sometimes what we're seeing is that this is a discussion between, you know, immigrant women and immigrant women. So we need to open this dialogue to really look at the list of assistants. I think we have 80% or more women listening to this, which is great. But then we need to make sure that we're taking these conversations at a different level, where we have the leaders that sometimes of the companies, if we think about the private sector, of the companies that are defining the policies for recruitment, that are defining sometimes these levels of recruitment, that they really are part of this discussion. So I think that's an important component of this. And I think we're starting step by step, but that's something that should be really one of the goals for the coming years.
Perfect, thank you.
I'll just add a quick note to that. Thank you for that, Catalina. That was great. I just feel like on the other side of the pandemic, every country is planning a comeback, every single one of them. And one of the opportunities we have as a region in Canada to up our game, if you will, to be more competitive, is to basically seize the opportunity that is having more women in STEM and more immigrant women in STEM involved in our businesses. In our region in Ottawa, we have almost 13,000 international students that are in STEM, you know, pre-pandemic. And each year, when they're done, they go home. And it's a missed opportunity to not have them consider Canada as a place to actually build their businesses. And so there's a lot that we could do to seize that export opportunity and that positioning, so that we actually ensure the future of our country and our place in the world and our ability to do tech for good in the world as well. So I think there's a lot here that we could work with.
Perfect, thank you so much. I have another question here. It says, computer science has the most workers and is the main driving force behind the growth and science workers. However, women contributed little to the increase in the number of computer science workers. Knowing the importance of diversity in the labor market, how can businesses encourage women to operate in a male-dominant industry? I guess that goes for all the panel. Okay, perfect. Catalina, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I can start, you know, with a couple of thoughts and let the others add to this. But I think, you know, I think we need to start, and that goes for STEM in general, and computer science in particular. We need to start really as a system change. We need to start from letting girls know that that's a field that could be of interest, where they could shine and where they could be brilliant contributors. So really encouraging women to enter this field. And now once we have people in this field, I think really, as Akiko was saying, also creating a space that is welcoming. And I see it a little bit in my experience in Colombia with the fourth industrial revolution, as Mike was saying, and all the women that are going into coding and that are passionate about, that are really strong, and that face so many male-dominated and aggressive environments. I think is really being conscious of the importance to create those environments that are welcoming, that are really open, and that that really give the space to a diverse workforce. So I think it's really on many different levels that we need to work.
Anybody else? Okay, Akiko, let's go, and then we can.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to kind of tag on to what Catalina was saying, you know, that the welcoming environment also includes safe environment. And I know that a lot of the barriers that women face, I'm not a computer scientist, so I don't know about that particular field, but in biomedical sciences in general, a lot of women face harassment and, you know, toxic environment within the workplace. And that's something that really drives women away from these fields. And needs to be really acknowledged and dealt with. And one of the things that we can do is really evaluate a mentorship as one of the criteria for success in academia. It just shouldn't be about just the papers you publish, grants you bring in. Those are important, but also mentorship and creating an environment that's safe and successful to everyone should be a high priority for evaluation.
Thank you. Michael, there.
I was just going to add the incremental thought here that what we've experienced in our work with female founders and women-owned businesses, there is a bit of a blurry line in terms of services business versus technology-centric businesses. It's a little bit off the point that was being asked, but it just strikes me that where the puck is going here, it's a Canadian term for those of us that like hockey, is that most businesses are moving to a very data-centric services orientation. There's a real natural affinity that women have for services businesses. The research shows that. And I feel that might actually be a driver for attracting more technical women to working with female founders and female owners of businesses as services businesses become more and more pronounced in this data-centric world that we're in.
Perfect. Alejandro, you were...
Well, I wanted to just put in that a lot also comes from K through 12, and there has to be a lot more work to get in the schools to make things like computer science, engineering, mathematics attractive, right? And in general, I think that's a challenge, and we have to really reach out to the educators and work with them and show them that, I have a friend who does outreach at schools, and she asked the students, what do you think mathematicians do? And he said, count, they count. Well, you can do all sorts of different things with math. So just showing them that these are neat concepts that you can go and become and do business, et cetera, and contribute. So I think that's something which society and us as funding organizations and companies should all come together and do that. And if we can emphasize the importance of women being involved and that whole minority population, that diverse population can really contribute, I think it's very important.
Fantastic. I think we are reaching the last 10 minutes for our panel. And before that, I want to ask the panelists to just give us, again, one single sentence about your recommendations to provide, in your role as a leader, to make STEM ecosystems more diverse, inclusive. One single sentence, please. Let's start by, I have in my, in the screen, Akiko, please.
Okay, it may sound repetitive, but I think that immigrants and women are the backbone of scientific innovation, and we must really keep encouraging and promoting them to reach excellence in science. And to do this, we really need to increase structures that support women, childcare, healthcare, maternal leave, and opportunity in general.
Thank you. Michael?
Thank you. I'm going to pick up on a point I was making earlier. So it's tied to governance. I mentioned the 50-30 program that Mr. Baines announced. And it's kind of like a voluntary thing. I'd love to see a path that from a regulatory perspective, we put incentives in place to drive more diversity on boards in its broadest sense.
Perfect. Alejandro, please.
Yeah, well, I would drill down on equity, diversity, and inclusion in all the processes that have to do with training and research. We can really be considering all the applicants fairly and in an inclusive way, and making sure that this talent that Canada attracts is properly channeled and that they can benefit from what Canada represents. It's a great wealth for our country.
Fantastic. Catalina, please.
Yeah, I think a lot of has been already said, but I will think that even though sometimes it's challenging to think about this, positive or, well, you know, just setting up numbers or percentages as a mandatory thing, as some countries did. My experience in Iceland, actually, when I lived there and worked there, and they really put as a mandatory thing that they had to have 50% of women in boards. I know that sometimes it's a difficult step to make, but it has paid. It has paid. In Scandinavia, we see a whole different environment. In Iceland, there's a whole different environment in terms of pay for women and the way they're climbing to some of the higher positions in some of these companies and having the first woman president in the world. So I think those things, even though sometimes are difficult to take, sometimes most of the time they pay. I go back to having role models. If we go back to computer science, if you think that to be a computer scientist, you have to, you know, dress in black, wear jeans, don't speak to anybody. And if you're a girl that likes pink and you like to go and talk to everybody, well, you know, from a personal perspective, you don't see yourself there. So I think opening these role models to have much more open and embracing and diverse. So speaking up for the few women that are in those fields, I think is important to show that that's possible. And I will end up by networking opportunities. And that's why I think initiatives like IWS are so important and they grow so fast, because well, we always talk about the all boys club, and basically the all boys club is that. It's like, you're my friend, I can give you opportunities. I call you when I know about a new job. The IWS network is basically the same. It's like, when I know a new opportunity, I call you because I know you. And so opening these paths and opening these opportunities, not just for women, but for all diversity in the workforce, I think is important.
Maria, thanks, Catalina. Maria.
Yeah, so I think, so earlier I mentioned the barriers that immigrants, in particular women in science are facing on this, with the distrust of their foreign credentials and foreign experience. So I think here I would like to highlight again that well, we need to reevaluate how current policies impact opportunities in terms of selection of immigrants in STEM, women, settlement support in general. This is not applicable only for women in STEM, but for immigrants in general. And to have clear information of the current job market in Canada and training programs. I think we need to bridge gaps between different sectors, from school to the government setting, to the private setting, to and each of those settings to their recruitment policies and their recruitment practices. And so I think it's also important to ensure that current employers' needs are incorporated into those policies, and that labor market information is also considered. We need also employers' engagement here.
Thank you so much. I think now we are almost at the end, and we can launch the second poll questions, and we can leave it until the end, but I will, in the meantime, I will be pulling up the first poll results to the first poll question. I think. Pooja, do you mind? Okay, sure. Okay, so what percentage of adult immigrants in Canada have a university degree in STEM? And the answer is 44%, and 50% of the audience have got it right. So yes. And what is the percentage of STEM educated immigrant workers who held jobs in STEM? And the right answer is 50%. And the answer, the majority of the people think that is 75%. So yes, unfortunately, it's only 50%. It's not as high. And I think we are almost at the end. We will have the second poll, and we can leave it until the end of the panel. Just it's about, we want to know who is in the audience. how many women, how many immigrant women. Again, it's about to know who is there. The question is, are you an immigrant with a STEM degree? And you're gonna see if we have what we expected. Please go ahead. And with that, I have 1 minute to say thank you so much to our panelists. I know how busy you are. I know how difficult, but also this shows your commitment, shows your passion, your work towards a better diversity, inclusion. I would like to thank as well Pooja for the fantastic job moderating. I would like to ask the committee of the IWS network. We were working for months, and thank you so much to all of you. And there are a few words that I would like the Canadian science policy to pay attention to. This is a call to action. It's this roadblocks. This is this like unconscious biases. This is the blind spots, and something that is coming up. It's opportunity. This is a huge opportunity for us. We are in unprecedented times, and I would like to encourage, take these words as an action for us as Canadians to make this country even more inclusive. Thank you to everybody. It was fantastic. It was an honor for me. Thanks. Pooja, I leave it to you.
Yeah, can we see the last pool? Can we see the last pool?
Let's see, let's see, Pooja, are you there?
Yes, so we have the results for the first poll here.
Yeah.
And what we see is that out of all the attendees, 44% are immigrant who are employed in STEM fields. So that's an impressive number as far as it goes for this panel. And then we have another poll, which is yeah, so I'm sorry. So the first poll was about if you're an immigrant employed in STEM field, and there are 44% of immigrants who are employed. And we had the second poll run, which was if they were immigrant in STEM with a STEM degree, and we see 45% of our attendees are immigrants with a STEM degree. So that's again, that's a very encouraging number for our attendees on the symposium. And would you like to have the last words before we call it off?
I think this was a fantastic discussion. I feel that we had the opportunity to bring new people, new ideas, and I'm hoping that more than anything from these initiatives, we would walk into action. I'm honored again, and please keep in touch. We are here. The IWS has offices in each city in Canada. Reach us and we can start working from there. And if anybody else has any other words.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you for such a wonderful session in that case. And please be back with us. We have a 20 minutes break. Please be back with us on 2:50 p.m. EST for our third panel, which is organized by the Mount St. Vincent University. So we hope to see you back here. Have a good day.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Welcome again to the third and the final session of the symposia. So please remember to turn your videos and microphones off. Please also remember to fill our short survey that I will be providing the links for in the chat window. So we are now gearing towards our third panel entitled Strengthening EDI Policies to to ensure diversity in the STEM sector. The panel is jointly moderated by Dr. Tamara Franz Odendahl, who is a professor at Mount St. Vincent University, Dr. Enimike Ferenhorst, and I'm really sorry if I misspelled your name, who is a professor at the University of Manitoba, and finally also Dr. Lale Bejat, who is professor at the University of Calgary. So welcome all of you and the panelists, and without any further ado, I leave the floor for Dr. Tamara Franz Odendahl to take it from here.
Thank you very much, Pooja, for that introduction. I would like to also add, in terms of introducing the moderators, that all three of us are either existing or past NSERC chairs for Women in Science and Engineering, and we're all immigrants to Canada, so relating to the previous panel. I would like to encourage the audience to please put comments in the chat and ask questions. We will have a Q&A at the end of the session. Unfortunately, one of our panelists could not join us today, but we have an excellent lineup for you. And we're going to get right started. And I would like to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves and to tell us what they are seeing from where they are positioned in academia or government or the not-for-profit sectors with respect to systemic barriers that have been amplified by COVID-19. So Sherry, would you like to start?
So I've unmuted myself. I am hoping that nobody is hearing the construction that is going on in my building. I run Informed Opinions, which is a national nonprofit that essentially trains and motivates and supports smart women to speak up. So we do a lot of work in collaboration with universities and research councils, really supporting women to have their voices heard and influence public discourse. And we have really seen the nonprofit sector be devastated and walloped with a huge impact by the coronavirus and the pandemic. In May, many of you may have seen this, the New York Times ran a headline that read, almost half of men say they do most of the homeschooling, 3% of women agree. And that kind of says it all when you appreciate that the nonprofit sector is 80% female employed. And at a time during the pandemic when our contributions are more essential than ever before, it's been a really hard time. At Informed Opinions, we lost 60% of our revenue overnight. And our main work relative to this conversation is we run a database that makes it easier for journalists to find women with experience and education-informed knowledge, to make it easier for them to find those women so that they can contribute their perspectives to public discourse. And the overdue attention being paid now to the impact on women and other equity-deserving groups of the coronavirus and how disproportionate that has been, has motivated many of the women in our network to speak up and to be heard. They've always understood that their voices were underrepresented and the consequences of that. Now they're really, as I say, motivated to engage, but many of them, as I'm sure we'll hear from other panelists, are being forced to abandon their careers, or they are literally dying because of them. So their voices in the decisions that we're making for the future are more important than ever, and it's more difficult to contribute than ever. And the last point that I would just make specific to the impact of the coronavirus is that media are in this moment more motivated to engage women's voices and to hear from Black, Indigenous, women of color, people of color more broadly, because they recognize the impact on those populations. And so, yeah, they're doing that. They're reaching out. The challenge, I think, for lots of Black women is they're exhausted by the labor involved in educating the rest of us about the fact that, yes, systemic racism exists. So those are among the challenges that we're noticing.
Thank you very much. I'd like to now call on Dr. Leslie Shannon to introduce herself and also comment on what she's seeing.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for making time today, and thank you for the introduction, Tamara. My name's Leslie. I am the NSERC Chair for Women in Science and Engineering for the BC Yukon region. I'm also head of the computer engineering option at Simon Fraser University. I really have to amplify and magnify what Sherry led with. This is the headline she talked about I had seen, and I'm living it and seeing it. And there's really two sides to it. I really feel like we haven't moved socially very far from 1950. There was a veneer of a change in our acceptance of differentiated social norms, but in a world where most households are dual income, the expectation that childcare, and even not just childcare, but the care of any dependents is shared, has not propagated. So I have a toddler, and when we went into lockdown and we lost childcare, my husband's boss basically said, well, do whatever you want. You just have to do all the things that are required of your contract. So I don't exactly know how he was supposed to do that and be of any help to me. And it created not only a lot of stress for me, but also a lot of stress for him, because he wanted to support me and was basically being told by his employer that childcare is my problem, which is a fundamentally shocking thing in this day and age. I believe a lot of people are really tired. When the term COVID fatigue came in, anybody who's having to help dependents, I mean, I have friends who are single parents. I have no idea how you are a single parent with a toddler right now and no childcare, and doing a job. Like, you have to do a job because somebody has to pay the rent and make sure there's food on the table. So it's been a real challenge. And I've been pretty disappointed in academia in terms of recognizing that institutional support is needed for the fact that we aren't at home working. We're trying to work from home during a pandemic where there are many systemic challenges. And I've seen some organizations, both industry and nonprofit, that have shown real leadership in recognizing how families have to be able to be families and do work. But it really is individual one-offs that have pulled from the leadership as opposed to a systemic acceptance of the world we are currently trying to live in.
Great, thank you very much, Leslie. I'd like to now call on Dr. Kevin Hewitt to do the same, introduce himself and make some comments.
Thank you very much, Tamara. So I am a single parent myself with young children at home. And I've never been so stretched in my career trying to manage a full-time job as a professor of physics and chair of the Senate here at Dal, while managing homeschooling for my two young children. So I can understand the issues that arise in that regard with respect to childcare obligations. In terms of the effect on those in precarious roles, those on the front lines, I should say that the data available in Canada pales in comparison to the data available in the US on the impact on Black lives. And throughout my conversation today, I'm going to speak to that issue, the paucity of available data across intersecting identities. It's really a failure of the Canadian system. We're way behind the US in terms of collecting that data to inform not only effect of COVID, but the healthcare system and its disparities. So just earlier this month, we launched in collaboration with the Canadian Association of Physicists, a survey of the diversity of the physics community in Canada. Accompanying that survey is questions related to the impact of COVID on your work and so on. So by the end of this month, we'll have some really solid data on the impact across a wide range of intersecting identities, because we have to disaggregate that data. Visible minorities, their compression into a single entity is another failure of the Canadian system. We don't all face the same disparities, different histories, etc. So, so that's, I guess, a preview of what I plan to discuss. I've been working as well for, I think, over 2 decades in trying to increase the number of African Canadians in STEM with an outreach program called Imhotep's Legacy Academy. It's now in its 17th year. It's a provincial program, an award-winning program that has resulted in significant outcomes within the 2-century history of Dalhousie University. We can say that more individuals have enrolled in STEM who have been in our program than have been graduates of Dal over that 2 decades. So, so that STEM outreach is about, reducing the isolation, and it's not applying a deficit model. These are individuals who have the talent. They're just isolated and face tremendous barriers. And we try to break down those barriers through this program. So thanks, Tamara.
Thank you, Kevin. So I'd like to ask Saj Velimir to introduce himself and make some opening comments.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Tamara. I am Serge Villemur. I am the Director of the Scholarships and Fellowships Division at NSERC and also the Director of the Chairs for Women in Science and Engineering program. It's a real pleasure to be on this panel, and I thank Tamara and my colleagues for having invited me to be on this panel. It is humbling in a way, because when I see the knowledge and expertise that my colleagues have on this panel, it's pretty amazing. So I'm sure that I will learn a lot. Just to respond to the few questions that were posed to us at the beginning, my interest in EDI is kind of a long story, but let's say that it started with my involvement with the Chairs for Women in Science and Engineering program, which also allowed me to start to be involved, because I was, I guess, managing the program at the council, to be involved in various gender summits internationally. And my work in the gender summit really allowed me to realize that there was a big gap in science and engineering policy. And this big gap was the consideration of EDI in research. And I also realized in reviewing the material when I was preparing, I've always considered myself an expert in terms of like managing peer review and science policy and so on. But when reviewing the material in preparation for these gender summits, especially the first one I was involved in, I realized, wow, there is a big gap. And we're much farther from research excellence than I thought that we were. So that was a big eye-opening initiative, these gender summits for me. So there is a big gap that we need to fill. As with COVID, we heard at the council, we heard early on from researchers about the challenges that they were facing due to COVID, and the fact that these have been very unequal across the system. We did release in September guidelines on how these impacts should be described by applicants and considered by reviewers, But the key goal of these guidelines is to serve as an educational tool to clearly acknowledge these inequities and to reinforce the notion that the Council considers them seriously and expect that they will be considered by reviewers. So we hope to use the information that we will see in the upcoming grant proposals and scholarships proposals to figure out a way to best support a diverse STEM community. So I will just also say that the COVID situation has been well documented, and my colleagues on the panel have talked about them. But it's pretty easy to see, I guess, that the ones mostly responsible for performing work outside the workplace, as Leslie has mentioned, such as caregiving, managing family, and so on, and the less privileged in society are more likely to experience more hardship. So we should really consider that very seriously. So I'll stop here. Thank you, Tamara.
Thank you very much. So as you can see, we have a diverse group of panelists with us today. So what we would like to do now is launch our first poll for the audience. So voting is underway. We'll give it a couple more seconds here. Okay, so it looks like we have very close in terms of the number of people who have increased care or household tasks at home to the point that they're experiencing a decline in their work productivity. And we will launch our second poll. So relative to your typical professional workload prior to COVID, have your job demands during COVID-19 increased, stayed the same, or decreased? And whoa, it's looking pretty interesting. We have a couple more seconds to go, and then it looks like everyone would have voted. Okay, so it looks like most people, well, 48% of people have noticed a substantial increase in their workload, professional workload. Some say it stayed the same, and very, very few say that there was a decrease. Okay, great. So with that in mind, I would like to, at this point, hand over to my co-moderator, Lali Bejat, to continue with our discussion.
I was muted. Thank you very much. I'm Lale Behjad. I'm a professor in the electrical and computer engineering from University of Calgary. So I'm situated very close to the beautiful Rockies. And I'm also the new chair for the Women in Science and Engineering in the Prairie region. So, and I'm very happy to be the co-moderator for this session. So the question I wanted to ask is about systemic barriers. And one of the reasons I'm going to ask this is we have been trying to increase the percentage of women and other underrepresented groups in the STEM since 1970s. And we have put a lot of effort into this. However, despite our efforts, we have not made any significant improvement. And in some cases, such as computer science or physics, we have actually seen the percentage of women going down. In my belief, this is an indication of systemic barriers to the full participation of women and other underrepresented groups. And that these systemic barriers exist. And it shows also that our efforts were not directed at removing these barriers. So as an example, wage gap is a well-studied problem that is caused by bias in hiring, by promotion practices, inequitable leave policies, and the general expectation that it is okay to have women earn less for equal or more work. However, the solutions that we have come up with to address the wage gap have been to either ignore the problem or give a one-time wage increase instead of solving the systemic and root causes of the problem. So now, because of COVID, many of these systemic barriers have been unmasked, especially for women and other underrepresented groups. So some of the examples can be childcare, elder care, or issues related to Black Lives Matter. So I want to ask first Kevin and then Leslie that from your experience, can you tell us if the EDI considerations that have been implemented to address the specific issues you have been facing have resulted in superficial solutions before and during COVID? And if you could give us a sense of what solutions can solve some of these root causes. Kevin, would you be able to start first?
Great, thank you very much. So I think anyone will be aware of the fact that the last year with the George Floyd incident has highlighted the Black Lives Matter movement. More generally, Black and Indigenous lives, and it's exacerbated as well as exposed that disparity. So the question was around EDI considerations. Have they led to superficial solutions before, during COVID? So let me focus on before COVID. I think you can look to any set of data that's available. The most, I think, comprehensive set of data comes from the Federal Contractors Program. And I performed this exercise something like 5 to 7 years ago, where I tried to find from various post-secondary institutions their report to the Federal Contractors Program. And I found very little. And where I did find data, in most cases over several institutions, over several years, what you saw was the lack of progress on one category in particular, that's racially visible individuals, with hundreds in the gaps of 100 or more in the faculty and professionals category. So, you know, our policies, our EDI policies, which have been employment equity, which has been around for some time, you know, more than 2 decades, have not really impacted the participation rate of racially visible individuals. This despite the fact that racially visible individuals comprise 40% of the undergraduate population, 40% of master's students, falling to about 30% for PhD students. So it's not a lack of availability, right? When you get to a stage where we have these committees deciding on hiring, all of a sudden we see a huge drop. So we don't have data, again, on specifically the progress within pathways to leadership for Blacks in particular. But the conversation is changing. We see that the discussion of the impact of COVID and more generally the discrimination in the system has forced the conversation to discuss Black lives and the fact that the Canadian state for 200 years was a slave state. We celebrate 3 decades under the Underground Railroad, but hide away the 200 years in which we also had segregation in this country. In Nova Scotia, for example, the segregation was outlawed in 1954. So Blacks in Nova Scotia have been in segregated schooling over a 143-year period, compared with the 61 years that they've been in a non-segregated school setting. Viola Desmond as well has highlighted the fact that there was segregation in the theater that she tried to access. That's in 1946, almost a decade prior to Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. So this, the story of Black Canada has been emerging from the national closet during COVID. It's exposing the reality of the Canadian state. And unfortunately, we're behind our American counterparts in really having the data to be able to not only examine representation at various levels, but also trying to measure what particular policies would positively impact that representation. So, the other aspect that COVID has highlighted, and that's true in Nova Scotia as well as the rest of the country, with the notable exception, I think, of Toronto, is public health officials' lack of reporting on by race. Okay, so we can't really get into the discussion of the systemic barriers and ways in which we could address them without that data. And that is the problem of Canada. There's been a collective silence. You could call it a strategic ignorance, as Charmaine Nelson has said. And as Afua Cooper has said, it's an erasure of Blackness in the Canadian context. So I'd like to finish by saying that when we also think about those wage gaps, we have to think about the multiple intersecting identities. And I'll speak later to the work that has been examined by the equity myth to show that that wage gap is additive based on multiple identities. So it's time for us to actually be able to answer the questions that are posed here by getting the data.
So it seems that your problems are a lot worse, or the problems that the racialized underrepresented groups are worse than the wage gap, because we don't even know what the problems are to some extent without having the data.
Well, the only set of data available is in that equity myth book. So.
Thank you. Leslie, would you want to sort of have a few comments here? And also, I would encourage people to put in some of the problems that they see in their workplace, just so that sort of we can see that not only the diversity of the problems that are not going to be addressed by everyone in this panel, but we can at least just have an acknowledgement of them. Leslie, please.
Thank you, Leila. And thank you, Kevin. I feel really honored to get to follow on you on this conversation, because I agree, I'm a computer engineer. I love my data, and it's hard to make informed decisions when there are no data. To the before and after, I think we've gotten to the point in the conversation that we realize there are definitely problems. And I think COVID has even amplified how some of these things are problems, but we don't have solutions, because some of it's with a lack of data, but we haven't clearly identified the problems. We've just, okay, this doesn't work, but what is this? And what's the part that's not working? So before COVID, I would have said that I was a rather overworked individual, because I was a woman in computer engineering, and in my particular area of hardware research, the participation of women is about 3%. So the big joke is every time I go to a conference, every woman has her own bathroom stall. And that ends up meaning that I am trying to not only sort of forge my own path, but make sure there's a wide path for people behind me. One of the statistics I think that's really important to keep in mind, and when I found this out, this was a while ago, I was really kind of shocked, but straight white men make up 35% of the Canadian population. So when we talk about underrepresented groups and equity deserving groups, we're talking about the large majority of the population. This reflects most of us. And the fact that the world is not designed for most of us is pretty fundamentally disturbing. Now, most of us didn't have a voice when these designs were being put into place, so it's kind of understanding how they got here, but it also is a very clear reason to say they need to be pulled down and rethought. Expecting me to break my own glass ceiling by somebody else who was put there by somebody else is a really bizarre expectation. You put a barricade in my place, and now it's my job to pull it down. You put it there, you should take it down. And the previous panels where they were talking about merit and success and excellence, those are very personal words. How I will define success for myself and excellence for myself is very different than how somebody else might define it. And there's a very broad spectrum of characteristics that are considered in any of these words. And what I weight as being more important than somebody else will then impact how I quantify someone's characteristics and someone's definitions. And I really don't like using these words because they have such a personal meaning. It's kind of like saying how you feel about the word love. It's very personal. So if we want to talk about somebody's ability to do something, it's about criteria and quantified metrics of evaluation. And so we're at the point of, we need to identify criteria better. We need to separate want from need. And this really flows into the pandemic really strongly, because we had a lot of processes pre-pandemic of things that people wanted. And now that there are many of us just trying to get by, you might want me to send you an email to instigate some sort of action. But if I get 6 to 8 hours a day in front of a computer because of reduced childcare, is it the best use of my time to make me send emails that could be perfectly well written by my graduate students and then CC'd to me so that I could say, yes, okay, I see it. And if you don't see anything from me, we're good. And just the fight to get people to say, you want this, I respect what you want, but we're in a position and a space where we have to actually move back to what you need. Because otherwise, the people who are getting penalized are my grad students who are, you know, housing and financially insecure compared to the staff and the faculty. If their payroll does not get put through because I cannot reply to an email in a timely fashion, that's horrendous. So we need to work in multimodality better. We need to recognize that this pandemic is hitting everybody very differently. Everybody's stress and anxiety has been raised probably, but if you were at a 1, maybe it's been raised to a 3 or 4, so you're now uncomfortable. But there were a lot of people who were at a 5, 6, or a 7. And those are serious mental health challenges and limitations to how we have only so much health and so much time, and we do need to find some space for ourselves. So I would just urge people who are in decision makers to really sit back and really work on separating want from need, process from evaluation, and defining metrics for what the criteria they value are, and stop thinking that we can all universally accept and define the meanings of excellence, success, and merit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leslie. And I'll hand it to Anamika to go to the next part.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. My name is Annemike Vernorst. I'm the Associate Dean of Research of the Faculty of Agricultural and Food Sciences at the University of Manitoba. And thanks, Leslie, for letting us know that white men only represent 35% of the Canadians. Well, they hold most of the power in Canada. At least we know that statistic. So I'm sure that everyone agrees with me that the year 2020 has been a very strange year. I can't think of any year in my life that has been so odd. We continue to lose lives because of COVID around the world. We continue to experience in many countries police brutality and also resulting in death. And then 2020 was also the year in which Ruth Ginsburg died. And up till her death in September, Ruth Ginsburg had served for more than a quarter of a century as an associate justice on the United States Supreme Court. And she was only the second woman to do so and the first Jewish woman to do so. And there's a famous quote of hers, which is definitely my favorite, and I'm going to read it out here today. When I'm sometimes asked, when will there be enough women on the Supreme Court? And I say, when there are 9, people are shocked. But there has been 9 men, and nobody ever raised a question about that. So in Canada, a few years ago, we celebrated the 100th year anniversary of the women's right to vote in federal elections. In essence, what we really were recognizing is that only a portion of women obtained that right to vote. Some BIPOC women had to wait much longer. For example, First Nations didn't have the right to vote in federal elections until 1960 without losing their treaty status. So let's talk a little bit about intersectionality. I know it came up at the previous panel, and I would like to welcome Sherry back. And Sherry, you are an award-winning women's advocate. You are the founder and champion of Informed Opinions. And the mission of Informed Opinions is to amplify women's voices for a more democratic Canada. And in advocating for women and for diversity. And so question for you, whose voices are we hearing and who is left out of the discussion?
It is heartbreakingly predictable. It will be a surprise to no one on this panel or indeed sitting in on this session. White, affluent, cisgendered, heterosexual urban men with law degrees and business credentials. Many of them are dominant and pretty much everyone else is, relatively speaking, missing in action. 10 years ago, when I founded Informed Opinions, women's voices we were only being quoted 1 in 5 times. That's the data we had. And so we founded the project in order to address that. And in all realms of discourse, again, this won't be a surprise, but in media, which is our focus, but at conferences, in meetings, in organizations, women are invited to speak less often than their male colleagues, and we decline much more often. And there are a boatload of good reasons for that decline. We know that we're going to be held up to a higher standard of authority. Again, that's been referenced in explicit and inexplicit ways throughout the day, I'm sure. We know that if we increase our profile, we're likely to be criticized for our appearance, our sexuality, our marital status, all sorts of completely irrelevant criteria, and trolled in ways that our male colleagues, I think many of them have no clue about. And at Informed Opinions in the summer, we did a roundtable with women from diverse backgrounds who are in our database, who are actively speaking up. And the stories that we heard from them, you know, I've been getting hate mail for 30 years, but I had no idea of the vitriol that the women of color, Black, Indigenous women, Muslim women face in the current environment where social media facilitates that kind of online abuse. So we're working actively to overcome all of those barriers, to motivate, train, and support women to speak up and share their insights through media. And between 2010 and 2018, that helped us to increase the percentage of women being quoted in Canadian media from 22% to 27%. That's a significant movement in those 8 years. And then 2 years ago, we partnered with Simon Fraser University, some big data scientists, to build the Gender Gap Tracker, which is a digital analytics tool that measures in real time the ratio of women versus men being quoted by Canada's 7 most influential news media. And we believed that by creating the Gender Gap Tracker, you can Google it, it will come up right away, that by making that chronic underrepresentation visible, we would speed up the rate of progress. And indeed we have. A little over a year after the project was launched, the needle had moved another 4 points, which was, I mean, it still was only at 31% this summer and early this fall, but still that was a significant leap. And clearly also the space given to Doctors Bonnie Henry and Teresa Tam has helped. The tracker is lower in the last week, and I suspect that's partly a function of November and November 11th and the Remembrance Day coverage. The tracker's reliance, and I do need to say this in this context, our reliance on scraped data from the news media websites means that we don't have the capacity to measure diversity beyond binary gender data, and we're unable to track the ratio of people of color, of lesbians, of, you know, diverse populations in all of those intersectional identity ways. And so our data is very restricted in terms of its ability, but it does give us an indicator, and it is motivating journalists, along with the Black Lives Matter and the appreciation that many news media have, that their ability to remain relevant in a world where an increasing proportion of the Canadian population are indeed immigrant Canadians, are indeed people of color, Indigenous people, they're in their own moment of reckoning. And so what we're seeing is a really substantive effort to outreach and diversify the voices that are reflected in their coverage, both in terms of who's telling the stories and who gets to be quoted in the stories. So that's a source of optimism, as late and insufficient as it is.
Yeah, thanks, Sherry, and congratulations on all of the progress that you have made. It's so very important. So you mentioned that white men in particular are clueless about some of the things that is happening to racialized people, women, etc. And I do agree with that. And we often talk about workshops for women, for example, but I wish there would be more workshops for men to actually understand things. Having said that, Serge, I have to admit, you are someone that I think is quite knowledgeable. And so you're the director at the Natural Science and Research, and I would say integrating equity for inclusion in funding models and I would like you to speak topic about it being programming that NSERC is doing, what is still missing perhaps with respect to intersectionality in this EDI programming.
Okay, thank you very much, Annemika. Again, very nice to be here. I missed most of your introductions because of technical issues with the sound, but we have the question, so I will gladly try to address it best I can. There is some specific issues within that question, like the NSERC CDI approach, and then how intersectionality is being acknowledged, and then what is still missing. So I will try to address that very concisely in a couple of minutes. So we actually started in 2014 to build an EDI framework for the agency. So about 6 years ago, now the 3 granting agencies are working together to align their EDI initiatives. And the launch of programs such as Dimensions, based on the ETNS1 model in the UK, and the initiatives taken on by the New Frontiers in Research Funds program are also great opportunities to try to move the needle with respect to the consideration of EDI in STEM. I will mention that we are according to schedule, basically with our EDI framework at the Council. We had initially planned that by 2020, we would have incorporated EDI in all 3 of our programs areas, the Discovery Program, the Scholarships and Fellowships programs, and the Research Partnerships program, and we are there. So very happy to say that we are actually there. Applicants are now required to address EDI as part of the training criterion. For example, both in Discovery grants and the Alliance programs, they have requirements for training plans in which applicants must describe their efforts to promote EDI in their teams, explain the types of challenges that they have to overcome, and how they include each perspective. So basically, this is now part of the criteria, which is a nice step forward. Regarding the research content, applicants are now asked to consider and describe how various diversity factors and their intersections have been incorporated throughout their research. So we want to promote the notion that extrapolation of the results to the population as a whole, when they actually only apply to a portion of the population, is misleading and could have serious implications, very serious implications actually. Although I'm talking about the great progress we have made, a lot remains to be done in the discussion today, earlier in this panel and the panels before. Some of the great issues have been talked about, but yeah, a lot remains to be done. And one of the big thing I think that needs to be done, that was referred to a bit earlier, is that the EDI consciousness of the research community as a whole, and that includes the granting agencies, needs to increase still. It's nice to have nice policies, but it's another thing to implement them. And when you are tackling or wanting to change policies in STEM, you are really addressing the culture that's been in place for, like, I don't know, 200, 300 years, the Eurocentric culture. That is very, very hard to change. So even in our reviewers and the staff, there is some unease in terms of addressing or responding to questions with respect to EDI and how to address it. So we need to continue our learning on that. As to how to translate intersectionality to research and policy, this is an ongoing challenge. Intersectionality is not well understood, and there is some discomfort in raising the subject on the part of many. In a way, intersectionality is embedded in our selection criteria. When we ask applicants to discuss and acknowledge in their teams or their research teams or teams of students that there are multiple forms of systemic discrimination that block people from realizing equal opportunity, and that these forms of discriminations have compounding effects on individuals, this is addressing intersectionality. But as I said, these are difficult concepts to grasp, and I'm certainly not claiming that we have mastered at the council, but in the research community as a whole, because I like to, the council is obviously a government agency, but I like to position the council as well as part of the research community. And when the research community moves forward on EDI or any other fronts, it needs to include universities and the granting agencies and so on. So I will also say that the agencies have expanded their collection of self-identification data, which will soon allow us to have a closer look at competition results. And these may help us to get some insight on the success rates of applicants who may have intersectional identities. But more work needs to be done. The data we have, we've only started to collect it 2 years ago. So before we have a good data set, it will take a while. So we need to continue to work in that front. And maybe addressing the part about what's missing, I think what's missing still, and that has been referred earlier by other panelists in the previous sessions as well, is a broader understanding of how EDI is a central part of research excellence. We cannot fully incorporate EDI in research without challenging the way excellence in research is being defined and evaluated. So, for example, community-based research or incorporating traditional knowledge in the research, getting the expertise from those who are holding this traditional knowledge is very important. Another example is mentoring students from, especially from underrepresented groups, to increase their sense of belonging, so that they can be themselves in the lab or in the research group, is very important. And these are great contributions that should be recognized. At the moment, working with the culture we have now, these things are not well recognized at all. So, but they do foster research excellence. So we need to not necessarily work on defining what the criteria are. We need to work more on how to apply the criteria, and not only focus on certain types of research contributions and ignoring other types of contributions that are just as valid. One thing that the granting agencies have done is to sign the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, so DORA. This is a great step forward or towards rethinking research excellence. And I will end by saying that EDI in general is a difficult subject matter, but we do have a collective responsibility to educate ourselves on the subject, so we understand what is the business case for EDI, and also the discomfort that EDI may create. EDI does create a lot of discomfort. As I was mentioning earlier, lots of people are nervous about talking about EDI or certain issues that may come up with members of underrepresented groups, and we need to overcome this discomfort. And understanding the business case and overcoming the discomfort are great pathways to innovation. So we should keep that in mind. So I will just end by saying that EDI is part of the continuous learning, and we collectively, we must undertake this learning. Thank you, Tamara.
Thank you so much, Serge.
Anemika, sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, Anemika.
That's all right. Thanks, Serge. Could you repeat what the abbreviation? I think you said DORA stands for. It's that maybe people want to Google. Is there something available online on that?
Yeah, you can easily Google what the DORA is. It is a declaration basically that has been signed by many, many organizations, including the granting agencies. And DORA is the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessments. And it's basically a call to look at how research is assessed differently. So it's also a call to decrease or eliminate the importance that we give to impact factors, for example, or to big list of publications in refereed journals. And it calls for consideration of, for example, software development, applied research, and other types of research that are just as valid as publications that should be looked at, should be looked at more than looking at impact factors to judge the excellence of a given researcher. So if you Google DORA, D-O-R-A, it will be easy for anyone to find what the declaration is in more detail.
Right, and I just noticed someone put the link in that.
Oh, thank you.
I'd like to check that out. So on the personal, so in my life.
Sorry, Anamika, can you switch your video off because your sound is very bad?
Yes. Yes, sorry.
Maybe if you turn the video off.
Yeah, I live in a rural community, so sometimes the internet is pretty bad, but I hope everyone hears me.
Yeah, that's good.
So yeah, okay, great. So speaking of Anamika, on a note, I have experienced sexism and homophobia in my life, and I've observed racism, and I really believe that Canada as a society allows systemic racism to continue. And so with that, I would like to do 2 polls. The first poll, if someone can help me with putting that up on the screen. The first, have you done any research or reading about institutionalized, and the choices are relatively easy. It's either yes or no. And I will give you a little bit of time to enter either yes or no. So I will give it a few more seconds here. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And thank you very much for those that have answered. I am glad with this answer. 84% actually says yes. If you want to add any advice for references, please put it in the chat box, and I'm sure that that other people appreciate that. So the second poll I would like to do is if someone can again assist me with that. And the second poll, do you feel that your administration and or management is not considering the situation of underrepresented groups, and there's a definition there, in their respective workplaces when instituting new policies due to COVID? This time we have the choices, yes, no, or me. And if I count down, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you very much for answering this second poll. And I see a little bit of a division, but the majority is actually stating no. So I would like to address one more item, and this comes back to the poll that asked about readings. What kind of readings have you done? And I would call Gavin. And Gavin, you are the chair of Senate at Dalhousie University. You are, like myself, a professor, but you are in the Department of Physics. And atmospheric science. And I also know that you are
I hope you're saying nice things about me because I can't hear what you're saying. I can go ahead.
Recommended the equity myth, and I would love you to talk about that book and tell us a little bit about it as well as your own experiences.
Okay, I think I have a rather limited time. Could you let me know if I have 2 minutes? So I'd like
you have
to.
about 2 to 3 minutes.
All right, let me just highlight 5 areas. I won't go into detail because there's for lack of time. This book is the first comprehensive evidence-based view of the lives of racially visible Indigenous faculty at Canadian institutions. So the 5 conclusions as it relates to policy prescriptions I found as follows. Number 1, the book has overturned some myths about why racially visible and Indigenous faculty are not progressing. It's not because they're not producing. Secondly, existing employment equity policies have not worked for this group. Racism remains intractable in Canadian society, and this is the evidence in this book. Some policies that would help: cluster hires of groups that are underrepresented using preferential hiring approaches. An excellent example is Dalhousie's Diversity Faculty Award, which is based on the University Faculty Award that NSERC pioneered some years ago. Speaking of which, that particular program excluded racially visible individuals during its history. I think if an individual wishes to pursue legal case in regard to that exclusion, I think it would be well-founded. NSERC needs to revive that program and fix the problems that were uncovered during the review. The process of evaluating tenure and promotion needs to look at other models like Boyer's model of scholarship. Very importantly, when we talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion, diversifying whiteness has to be a part of the conversation. At some institutions like University of Calgary, it's 2/3 white females, 1/3 white males. Where are the racially visible individuals at Canadian institutions? Again, the data shows that racism is a problem that has not been solved. Again, I'll emphasize, as I do over and over again, the paucity of data. Institutions have to conduct an annual census, and Dalhousie is doing that. We can now track those changes over time. So the other thing I would also mention in relation to earlier conversations that Leslie pointed out, white men need to be the one to break the ceilings. Dalhousie's Diversity Faculty Award was proposed, put in place by white male who saw the problem and said, I'm going to try to fix it using the available data. NSERC, I think, and other tri-councils need to also make childcare an eligible expense in the grants program and allocate a larger amounts. And I think the NFRF New Frontiers Research Fund is leading in the application of EDI to the research. It's evaluated on a pass-fail basis. And if the proposal does not pass that step, we do not consider the rest of the proposal. So that is an EDI approach that has real teeth. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin.
Thank you.
We are hitting our end of our time here. Sorry, I'm going to try and share a resource slide that we created, and then we'll hand over back to our session moderator. So Pooja, if you want to take over while I try to share this.
I'm sorry, Tamara. Yes, if I just couldn't hear you very well. I think I had a connectivity problem.
Sorry, you can wrap up the session while I try share.
Okay, all right. So all I just want to say is basically thank you everyone who presented the sessions, and all the panelists and moderators who did an amazing job. And finally, thank you to all the attendees who not only attended the session, but also asked thought-provoking questions and facilitated the discussions so very well. So we look, of course, forward to hearing you more and more often to have such lively, enriching discussions in future. And with that, I would just say that the session, the symposium, we just conclude the symposium, and we wish that you enjoy the rest of CSPC 2020 as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
And if you have any burning last questions, please put it on the chat. I will, in the next few minutes, and I will gather them, and we try to answer them as much as possible and share the answers with the people who participated.
Yes, I just also wanted to add that please do not forget to fill the short survey that I have provided the links before for, and I am going to provide the links again also. This will really help us in making CSPC a better experience for you for the next time. So that's that. Thank you so much for attending.